The wind blew on Mount Olympus, carrying with them the echo of ancient discussions, divine laughs and oaths of revenge. The gods were not perfect, they were powerful, yes, but their hearts were full of jealousy, love, grudges and ambitions. Highly, surrounded by clouds that seemed to tear with rays of Zeus, the immortals ruled a world that did not always understand or respected. Zeus, sitting on his golden throne, was the force that maintained balance, although his own pride blinded him. The other gods cautiously observed each of their movements. There was Athena, the goddess of wisdom, with a cold and calculator look that hid an anger flame ready to burn. No one could question his intelligence or his power in battle, but his greatest weapon was his strategy, his ability to anticipate others. His armor shone like a warning, and his owl, always present in his shoulder, seemed to monitor every corner of the Olympus. Athena was a goddess who valued order and purity. His devotion for justice was known, but was also known for his resentment. He did not forgive easily, and those who challenged her ended up cursing her name. Among the gods, Athena was respected, but feared. He was not someone to play with. On the other hand, he was Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose temperament was as unpredictable as the waves he ruled. His beard seemed to move with the rhythm of the storms born in his heart. Poseidon had spent centuries trying to prove his strength, trying to demonstrate that his domain of water was not inferior to Zeus's over heaven. But that need for validation made it dangerous. He had a wild charm that made him irresistible, but his ego led him to make mistakes that even his trident could fix. Poseidon could not stand Athena. They had been enemies since both had struggled to control the city of Athens. Athena, with his cunning, had offered the olive tree as a symbol of peace and prosperity, winning the favor of mortals. Poseidon, humiliated, never forgot that defeat. That wound, although buried under the depths of the ocean, kept bleeding every time he saw Athena walk with that haughty that seemed to shout that she would always be better. And then I was Medusa. But not the jellyfish that everyone remembers with snakes in the head and a look that turned men into stone. No. Before the fate made her a monster, Medusa was a deadly young woman like a freshly opened flower, with a brightness in the eyes that could rival the stars. She was not a goddess or daughter of Titans, but her beauty and purity were enough to attract the attention of the immortals. Medusa served as a priestess in the temple of Athena. His life was dedicated to the goddess, and his oath of chastity was an act of respect and devotion. For Athena, Medusa was a reflection of everything she valued: discipline, loyalty, and perfection. But in Olympus, even the purest devotion could become a curse. There were eyes that watched from the shadows, waiting for the right time to destroy the sacred. The Olympus was not a place of peace. The gods fought among them not only for the control of the mortal world, but for something darker, something more human: recognition. Every act they made, every decision they made, was impregnated with a desire to be seen, admired, feared. And in that scenario full of intrigues and conspiracies, the destinations of Athena, Poseidon, and Medusa would cross, leaving scars that even time could erase. In Olympus, the fight was not always with swords or tridents. The words were weapons, the silences were traps, and the alliances collapsed as sand castles to the first blow of a wave. Athena and Poseidon were the perfect example of this dangerous dance. His confrontations were not always direct, but each sought an opportunity to hurt the other, to show him that power was not enough if he had no respect. Olympus's air was loaded with electricity, as if the world itself knew that something was about to happen. Mortals followed their lives, offering sacrifices and prayers, outside the intrigues that developed above them. But the balance was fragile, and in the center of everything was Medusa, still unconscious of the role it would have to play in this tragedy. The laughter of the gods resonated in the rooms of Olympus, but behind each smile there was a threat. Athena sharpened her spear while Poseidon immersed himself in the seas, both preparing for a confrontation that would change the destiny not only of Medusa, but of the entire world. The sun caressed the coasts of Seriphos Island with a light that seemed to bless everything it touched. There, among the waves that broke gently against the rocks, he was born Medusa, a mortal girl with a beauty that did not belong to this world. From his first cry, his presence seemed to stop time. His eyes, an indescribable brightness, reflected the blue of the sky and the mystery of the ocean. His hair, long and dark, fell into waterfalls that seemed to dance with the wind. Her laugh, fresh like spring, was enough to attract anyone who listened to her. As he grew, Medusa became the pride of his family and his people. The elders looked at her with a mixture of admiration and fear, whispering that the gods should have given her that face as a gift. But others, more superstitious, said that such a beauty could not be natural, that it should be destined to attract chaos. And in the Greek world, mortals who approached too much to perfection always ended up paying a price. Medusa was different. Not only for its beauty, but for its spirit. He was curious, kind, and had a goodness that disarmed anyone who talked to her. He helped the elders of the town, took care of the youngest children, and spoke with a humility that denied the looks that followed her everywhere. But that constant, although flattering attention began to weigh on it. The men approached with empty gifts and promises, hoping to win their favor, while women looked at her suspicious, as if her mere existence were a threat. One afternoon, while walking on the shore, Medusa looked up at the sky and saw the temple of Athena in the distance. Her white column seemed to touch the clouds, and an inexplicable force led her to approach. Upon entering, he felt something he had never experienced before: paz. The aroma of the incense filled the air, and the statues of the goddess, with her spear and her shield, seemed to observe it with severity and protection. There, standing in the heart of the temple, Medusa felt a connection with Athena that could not explain. The priests of the temple noticed their presence and, at first, distrusted. What did a young woman like her, so beautiful and earthly, in a place dedicated to wisdom and war? But Medusa was not looking for attention. I only wanted a place where I could find comfort away from the insatiable looks of others. Day after day, he returned to the temple, offering flowers and prayers to the goddess. His devotion was pure, and over time, the priests saw something special in it. The news of his devotion reached the ears of the high priests, and after a lot of debate, a decision was made. Medusa would be accepted as a priestess of Athena. For her, this was the greatest honor I could imagine. His life would change forever, leaving the earthly world behind and dedicating himself completely to the goddess who had welcomed her. The day of his initiation was an event that no one in the town would forget. Dressed in a white robe that seemed to shine with its own light, Medusa walked the streets towards the temple. His hair was collected with a golden tape, and in his hands he wore an offering of scented oil. The villagers gathered in their path, some to admire her, others to say goodbye to her, knowing that the young woman they had known would no longer be part of their lives. In the temple, the priests affected him a small part of the hair as a symbol of his dedication, and Medusa delivered a sacred oath of chastity and eternal service to Athena. His heart was full of gratitude and determination. There, on the knees in front of the altar, she felt for the first time that she belonged to something bigger than herself. As a priest, Medusa flourished. His role was not just to pray or take care of the temple. The task of educating visitors about Athena's teachings was also assigned. He spoke with eloquence, with a passion that captivated everyone who listened to her. Even the noble and warriors who visited the temple were impressed not only because of their beauty, but for their intelligence and grace. But not everyone looked at her with good eyes. There were those who murmured that such a beautiful mortal did not take place in the temple of such a powerful goddess. Some even said that their presence was a provocation for the gods, a challenge that would eventually bring problems. Others, full of envy, wondered why Athena had allowed a simple mortal to have such an important place in her temple. Medusa, however, did not pay attention to rumors. I was happy, at least in appearance. But on the quieter nights, when the temple plunged into silence, Medusa looked at the moon from the columns and wondered if he was doing the right thing. He had sacrificed a lot: his freedom, his personal life, his opportunity to love. All for Athena. But he never doubted. His faith was stronger than any fear. Without knowing it, Medusa had become more than a priestess. It was a symbol of devotion, an example of mortal perfection in a world governed by immortals. And even that he felt safe under the protection of Athena, fate had other plans. There were eyes that watched her, not from heaven, but from the depths of the ocean. Eyes full of desire and ambition, eyes that did not respect the sacred. The temple of Athena was a place of light and purity, but the world outside its walls was full of shadows. Medusa, so strong and sure of its purpose, could not see that those shadows approached, ready to change everything. The roar of the waves echoed as an ancestral song, a force that seemed to speak the language of the gods. Deep in the ocean, where light could barely touch, Poseidon reigned, the god of the sea. His imposing figure was marked by brute force and a temperament as wild as the storms he unleashed. Poseidon was not just a god, it was the personification of the indomitable power of water, a constant reminder that nature could be as generous as devastating. His trident, a weapon that seemed forged in the very heart of chaos, was his symbol and his greatest tool. With a simple blow, it could lift waves that swept cities or open cracks on earth. But his power did not end there. The sea was his, and everything that lived in him was too. Each creature, from the little fish to the fearsome marine beasts, obeyed their mandate. However, Poseidon was not limited to governing the depths, his ambition was as vast as the ocean himself. Among the gods, Poseidon was known for his pride. He did not tolerate him to underestimate him or compare him with his brothers, especially with Zeus. That shadow was its greatest load. Although he was one of the three great gods of Olympus, along with Zeus and Hades, he always felt a step behind his older brother. Zeus ruled heaven and rays, imposing his will with an unwavering authority. Poseidon, on the other hand, felt that his dominance over the sea did not receive the respect he deserved. Mortals feared Zeus more than him, and that was running inside. But it wasn't just Zeus who turned on his anger. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, was a constant spine on its side. There was something in her that exasperated it deeply. Perhaps it was his arrogance contained, that air of superiority that seemed to tell him that his cunning was more powerful than his strength. Or perhaps it was the humiliation that still burned in his chest since that time they competed for the control of the city of Athens. That memory tormented him. When mortals asked the gods a gift to decide who would protect the city, Poseidon had hit the earth with their trident, sprouting a salty river that ran with the strength of the sea. It was an impressive show, a sample of pure power. But Athena, with his strategic mind, had planted an olive tree, symbol of peace, prosperity and life. The mortals chose the olive tree, and Athena became the patron saint of the city that would bear his name. The defeat was a blow to his pride, one who never forgot. Since then, the rivalry between them had only grows. Poseidon despised the coldness of Athena, that way of acting as if he always had a plan, as if every movement was calculated to make others stay as impulsive or inferior. For him, there was no honor in his methods. He considered her cold, distant, unable to understand the true strength that moved the world. And Athena, on the other hand, saw Poseidon as an impulsive being, more concerned with demonstrating his power than to use it with wisdom. However, Poseidon was not just pride and strength. There was a duality that few understood. The sea, after all, was not just a storm and destruction, it was also calm, beauty and mystery. There were times when Poseidon could be a generous god, offering riches and resources to mortals. On those occasions, his heart was softened, and his face, marked by years of anger and ambition, seemed to reflect something deeper, a desire to be recognized not only for his power, but also for what he could offer. But those softer facets were eclipsed by their explosive nature. Poseidon was not someone who knew how to wait. If I wanted something, I took it, regardless of the consequences. That impulsivity led him to make mistakes, but it was also what made him fearsome. For mortals, it was a god who had to placate, someone whose emotions could change the fate of a nation with a simple movement of their trident. In the depths of his being, Poseidon knew that the respect he longed for did not earn alone. But admitting it would be to recognize that Athena, with her intelligence and strategy, was right, and that was something she could never accept. In his mind, force should always prevail, because force was the only thing the gods really respected. Despite his rivalry, Poseidon felt a strange fascination by Athena. It wasn't love, not even admiration, but there was something in it that challenged him in a way they could do. It was as if, in each confrontation, Athena showed him a reflection of himself, a more contained version, more calculating. And that angered him, because deep down he knew that there was something he could learn from her, but his pride prevented him. The Olympus, with all its intrigues and tensions, was a constant battlefield, and Poseidon was willing to demonstrate that its power could not be ignored. But there was something else that was created in his mind. I had heard of a deadly Medusa, whose beauty was so dazzling that even the gods could not ignore her. Poseidon, driven both by desire and a strange need to demonstrate his superiority over Athena, set his attention on it. In the heart of the sea, while the waves rose with a contained fury, Poseidon raised his trident, feeling how the tension between the gods approached a breakdown. His ambition, fed for years of resentment, pushed him towards decisions that would change the destination not only of Medusa, but of himself. The waters began to stir, and the world, although he still did not know, was about to witness a tragedy that would resonate throughout the centuries. The part was majestic on the Acropolis hill, its white structure shining under the sun as if the gods themselves had carved each column with their own hands. There, in the heart of the temple, Medusa lived an existence that for many seemed a dream, but that for her was a constant act of faith and sacrifice. From the day he pronounced his oath of chastity, his life was consecrated to Athena, the goddess who had given her a purpose and protection that she did not find among mortals. Medusa ran through the halls of the temple with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. His white robe waved with each step, and his hair, although collected in a simple bun, continued to shine with an intensity that challenged the light of the torches. Temple visitors were fascinated not only for their beauty, but for the calm and devotion it transmitted. There was something in his gaze, a serenity that seemed to reflect the greatness of the goddess he served. But that beauty and that devotion were a double-edged sword. The men who arrived at the temple were dazzled by her, completely forgetting the reason for her visit. Even the most pious ended up murmuring confusing prayers as they tried to steal a last look at their face. He knew that his beauty was both a gift and a curse, something that separated her from the world even while trying to approach him. He had sacrificed his personal life, his dreams, even the possibility of loving, all for his faith in Athena. And although he never regretted, he couldn't help asking himself if the gods really understood what it meant to be deadly. As his fame grew, the envy of mortals also grew. In the market, women talked about it in whispers. They said that no mortal should be so beautiful, that such perfection could only be a challenge to the gods. Some even claimed that Medusa had used some kind of spell to win the favor of Athena, an accusation that reached the ears of the priests and that they dismissed with disdain. But those words, although they were not said in their presence, began to resonate as a constant murmur, a reminder that not everyone saw their devotion with good eyes. In spite of everything, Medusa remained firm in his faith. Each dawning, turned on the temple lamps and offered prayers to Athena. His voice, soft but full of conviction, filled the part with an energy that seemed to permeate the same stones. It was a moment of pure connection, an instant in which he felt truly close to the goddess who had promised to serve. But when the prayers ended and the temple was filled again with visitors, that connection faded, replaced by the furtive looks and envious whispers. The rumors soon getting further. Some said that Medusa had become Athena's favorite, that even the goddess, known for her severity, had shown signs of appreciation towards her. This only fed the resentment of those who already looked at her with disdain. The nobles who visited the temple began to question whether a mortal could be worthy of such honor. The same priests who had accepted Medusa in their ranks began to wonder if their presence in the part was a blessing or a threat. But Medusa, oblivious to much of these intrigues, continued to fulfill their duty. Every day was an act of service, a demonstration of his faith and his commitment. But it was also an act of resistance, a way to stand firm in front of a world that did not always understand it or accept it. And although I never said it aloud, I knew there was something fragile in its position, something that could break with the same ease with which a wave destroys a sand castle. In the background, Medusa was aware of his humanity. She knew that, as much as others elevated her to a pedestal, she was still a mortal, with fears, doubts and desires that she could not complete at all. And that humanity, that brightness that made it so different, was also what put it in danger. In a world where the gods were as unpredictable as mortals, Medusa walked on a thin line, without knowing that the forces that moved around them were about to change their lives forever. One night, while turning off the temple lamps, he felt a chill that he couldn't ignore. He looked towards the columns, towards the shadows that extended by marble, and for a moment, he thought he saw something to move in the dark. He shook his head, convinced that it was just his imagination, but he couldn't help feeling that something was changing. The lights of the part, which had always seemed warm and protective, seemed more distant that night, as if even the temple began to become strange to her. The air was loaded with a tension that Medusa could not explain, a feeling that would accompany it in the following days. Without knowing it, his devotion, his beauty and his humanity had caught the attention of someone who did not respect the sacred, someone whose desire and ambition were about to cross the walls of the part. And while Medusa continued with his life, faithful to his oath, the fate, relentless, approached as a storm about the horizon. The history of the gods is full of rivalries, but few are as deep and emblematic as the one between Poseidon and Athena. It was an enmity that not only marked their personal relationship, but extended as a crack in Olympus, even dividing mortals who venerated these two divine figures. It was a silent war of wills, strategies, and, above all, of pride. Both were powerful gods, with territories and skills that made them essential in the pantheon, but that did not prevent their differences from becoming a constant shock, such as the waves against the rocks. Poseidon, with his trident always ready to unleash the fury of the sea, represented brute force, the indomitable nature that could both create and destroy. His impulsive character and ambition were pushing him to claim more and more, always seeking to expand his domain. For him, the mainland was a challenge, a place that did not belong completely and that, therefore, wanted to conquer. In his mind, the supremacy of his power should be recognized not only in the sea, but also on the earth and in the hearts of mortals. Athena, on the other hand, was the opposite. His power was not manifested in physical strength or devastation, but in intelligence, strategy, and control. She was a goddess who valued thought before action, planning before violence. His spirit was serene, but no less fierce. Athena did not need to demonstrate her strength, because she knew that her wisdom was a much more sharp weapon. And although he did not look for the confrontation, neither did he shy away when he looked challenged. The best-known conflict between the two arose when mortals decided to found a great city and asked the gods to offer gifts. The reward would be immense. The god who presented the most valuable gift would be honored as the protector of the city, and his name would be immortalized in it. For Poseidon, this was a perfect opportunity to demonstrate its superiority over Athena. The idea that a goddess whose domain was knowledge could even compete with him, the god of the sea and storms, was insulting. On the day of the challenge, Poseidon came forward with all the arrogance that characterized him. He hit the rock with his trident, and a river sprouted with the force and fury of the sea. It was an impressive show. The waters seemed to dance in the sunlight, and mortals looked in amazement at the magnificence of the gift. But when someone came to try the water, they discovered that it was salty, unusable to drink or to water the crops. The gift of Poseidon, although majestic, was a sample of his power, not of his understanding of what mortals really needed. Athena, on the other hand, he approached calmly. He planted a seed on earth and, before everyone's eyes, an olive tree began to grow. Its branches extended gracefully, and the fruit it offered promised sustenance, oil and wood for construction. His gift was not as spectacular as Poseidon's, but it was practical, useful, a symbol of peace and prosperity. The mortals, grateful, chose the olive tree, and with him, to Athena as the protector of the city, who would since be named Athens. Poseidon's humiliation was absolute. Not only had he lost, but he had faced a goddess whose strength was not physical, but mental. For a god as proud and competitive as he, that defeat was a constant reminder that the brute force did not always prevail. The choice of mortals was a direct blow to his ego, and since then, the name of Athena became a constant reminder of his failure. But Poseidon's wounded pride was not there. The rivalry intensified over time, extending to other areas. Athena, with her reserved character, did not look for clashes, but did not retire when Poseidon tried to provoke her. Each interaction between them was an unplacated battle, a demonstration that none was willing to give in. Poseidon, in his fury, not only kept resentment towards Athena, but also towards the city of Athens and its inhabitants. On more than one occasion, he unleashed storms and earthquakes to punish mortals who had chosen the goddess about him. But Athena always found ways to protect them, whether strengthening the city walls or guiding them with their wisdom to face adversities. This constant exchange of forces created a palpable tension, a silent struggle that kept the enmity between them alive. However, there was something deeper in his rivalry, something that neither was willing to admit. Athena represented everything that Poseidon was not: calm, strategy, control. And in the same way, Poseidon embodied aspects that Athena rejected, but, deep down, also fascinated her: passion, overflowing force, chaos. They were opposite in every way, and maybe that's why their conflict never went out. Because, even if they did not recognize it, they needed each other to define what they were. The Olympus, with its atmosphere full of pride and intrigues, became the stage of its constant clashes. While the other gods watched with curiosity and, in some cases, with fun, Poseidon and Athena continued to measure strength, as if each dispute were a way to reaffirm their place in the pantheon. But the rivalries between the gods were never simple, and this would not be the exception. On the horizon, a tragedy began to take shape, one that would involve not only Athena and Poseidon, but also a mortal whose destiny would be caught in the center of its eternal struggle. The air in the temple seemed different that afternoon, loaded with an invisible weight that made each stone of the park vibrate. Medusa, as usual, was alone, fixing the offerings on the altar of Athena. His movements were soft, almost ritual, while his fingers slipped fresh flowers in a marble bowl. The sunlight entered through the columns, stroking his face with a golden glow that further enhanced his beauty. In his countenance there was a serene peace, a total delivery to his work, without suspecting that someone watched her from the shadows. Poseidon had reached the temple with a different purpose that day. He had heard rumors of the mortal whose beauty challenged natural laws, even those of the gods. For him, that was nothing more than a passing curiosity, something that could occupy a few minutes of his eternity. But when crossing the threshold of the part, his eyes met Medusa, and at that moment everything changed. She did not see him at the beginning, absorbed how he was in her task, but Poseidon was motionless, as if the weather had stopped. His gaze, who had seen the depths of the ocean and the most majestic creatures, had never contemplated something as a jellyfish. It wasn't just its beauty, it was the light that radiated, the perfect mixture of humanity and divinity that made it look untouchable, sacred. For a moment, Poseidon felt something that had not felt in centuries: vulnerability. It was the god of the sea, relentless and fierce, but there, in front of that deadly young woman, she felt small, caught in a desire she could not control. His breathing accelerated, and the sound of his trident hitting slightly the ground echoed in the temple, breaking the silence. Medusa raised her head, surprised. At first, he thought he was a visitor to the temple, perhaps a priest who had been late for prayers. But when fixing his eyes on the figure that raised between the columns, he knew he was not a common man. Poseidon's presence was overwhelming, like a throat tar that threatens to unleash at any time. Her hair and dews with an energy that seemed to move to the rhythm of the waves, and her eyes, of a deep blue, looked at her with an intensity that made her back instinctively. "Who are you?" asked Medusa, his voice trembling slightly, although he tried to stand firm. Poseidon took a step forward, his figure illuminated by the light that entered the temple. He did not respond immediately, he was too busy studying her, recording every detail of her face in her memory. Finally, he spoke, his deep voice echoing as the roar of a distant waves. "I'm Poseidon," he said, and those two words were enough to fill the space with an unquestionable authority. Medusa felt a chill to travel his back. I knew who Poseidon was, like all mortals knew it. It was the god of the sea, the bearer of storms, a force of nature that no one could challenge. But he also knew something else: he was in the temple of Athena, under his protection. And that protection, he thought, should be enough to keep it safe. "This is a sacred place," she said, raising her chin with a courage that she didn't know where she came from. "If you are looking for Athena, it's not here." Poseidon outlined a smile, a mixture of admiration and something darker, something that could not be defined with words. It wasn't Athena who was looking for, but I couldn't say it out loud. Instead, another step advanced, approaching Medusa with a calm that contrasted with the storm that burned inside him. "I know," he replied, his soft voice, but loaded with a power that filled the air. "But now that I am here, it seems that I have found something more interesting." Medusa took a step back, his hands tight against the edge of the altar. There was something in Poseidon's eyes that made her feel exposed, as if she could see beyond her skin, her flesh, directly in her soul. He had never felt fear in the temple, but now, with him there, that security seemed to crumble like sand under a wave. "I'm a priestess of Athena," he said, his strongest voice this time. "My life is dedicated to her. Nothing can happen here without your consent." Poseidon bowed his head slightly, as if he considered his words. But the spark of challenge in Medusa's eyes only fed something deeper in him, something he could not ignore. She was not like the other mortals she had met, those who surrendered to her power without even questioning it. Medusa was different, and that difference attracted him in a way he could not explain. "And what about your will?" he asked, his words loaded with a meaning that Medusa didn't want to understand. "Does it also belong to Athena?" Medusa did not respond immediately. His heart was beating hard on his chest, but he refused to be weak. In his mind, he repeated the prayers he had learned since he was a child, as if that could protect her from the god who now looked at her as if she were a lost treasure. Poseidon took a last step, almost completely closing the distance between them. The tension in the air was palpable, as the moment just before the lightning starts the sky. But before I could say something else, a subtle sound, like a murmur between the columns, seemed to interrupt the moment. It was as if the temple itself was responding, a silent warning that only they could hear. Medusa took advantage of that moment to step back, creating a distance that he felt desperately necessary. However, I knew this was not the end. There was something in Poseidon's eyes, a fire that would not go out so easily. And although I wanted to believe that Athena's protection would be enough, a small but growing part knew that something had changed. Something that could not undo. And Poseidon, when staying in the temple a few more seconds, let out a barely noticeable smile, as if he had already decided that this would not end here. The temple, which until then had been a refuge for peace, devotion, and purity, became the stage of a tragedy that would forever mark Medusa's life and unleash Athena's fury. The shadows of the sunset fell on the marble of the part, and the air, dense and loaded, seemed to presage the inevitable. Poseidon, blinded by his desire and for the pride of his divinity, refused to stop, ignoring the sacred limits that he had sworn respect. It wasn't just a matter of attraction, it was a matter of power, of imposing itself not only on a mortal, but also on its eternal rival, Athena. Medusa was alone, as always, performing the afternoon rituals in front of the statue of the goddess. His gaze was fixed on the light that was reflected in the eyes of the sculpture, a constant reminder of his faith and the protection that Athena granted him. But that afternoon, the protection did not arrive. The sound of heavy steps broke the silence, resonating with a disturbing echo between the columns. When he turned, he saw him again, Poseidon, with his imposing figure, advancing towards her as if the entire temple belonged to him. "Please, march," Medusa said, his firm but dyed voice of a fear that he couldn't completely hide. He knew that something was wrong, that God should not be there, that his presence was not a coincidence. But he did not respond, not with words. His eyes shone with a mixture of desire and challenge, a fire that could not be reasoned or turned off. Medusa took a step back, trying to create a distance between them, but the space seemed to shrink. The statue of Athena, which until then had been a symbol of strength and security, now felt like a silent figure, unable to intervene. Medusa raised his hands in an attempt to stop him, to make him understand that he should not desecrate that sacred place, but Poseidon did not stop. The moment Poseidon crossed the boundary between the sacred and the forbidden was like a ray that left the sky. The air seemed to freeze, and Medusa, trapped between horror and helplessness, felt how his world crumbled. It wasn't just his body that he took by force, it was his faith, his dignity, his humanity. Every second he felt eternal, a torment that would be recorded in his soul as a wound that would never heal. The marble of the soil, which had witnessed countless prayers, now seemed to absorb the weight of the brutal act, unable to reflect the purity of its original purpose. Medusa, a young woman who had dedicated her life to serving Athena, felt how her whole world crumbled under the weight of an injustice she could not understand. His resistance, although brave, was useless in the face of the force of a god who did not accept a no in response. And then, when everything ended, the temple was in absolute silence. Poseidon, without any remorse, simply moved away, leaving behind a trace of destruction that could not be repaired. For him, that was nothing more than a symbolic victory, a way of demonstrating that there was no place, not even the sacred temple of Athena, that it was out of reach. But for Medusa, it was the beginning of a nightmare that I could never forget. She fell to the ground, her knees hitting cold marble, while tears ran down her face. He tried to seek comfort in the gaze of the statue of Athena, but for the first time, he felt that the goddess was absent, distant, as if he could not or would not want to intervene. The feeling of abandonment was worse than the act itself. Why did Athena, who promised protection, had allowed that? Where was your justice? But silence did not last long. The air began to change, and the temple, which had remained motionless during the attack, began to vibrate as if it responded to a contained anger. The flames of the torches flashed violently, and an indescribable energy filled the space. Medusa looked up, his accelerated heart, when the statue of Athena seemed to come alive for a brief moment. His eyes, normally cold and inert, shone with a divine fury that made the ground tremble under Medusa's feet. Then, the voice of Athena resonated, not in words, but in a torrent of emotions that crossed the space: anger, disappointment, and imminent judgment. Medusa knew at that time that her suffering had not gone unnoticed, but also understood that the goddess would not focus on punishing Poseidon. Athena, in its severe and fair nature, did not tolerate the desecration of its temple or the violation of sacred votes. But the anger of the goddess would not fall only on Poseidon. Medusa, as mortal, would also be a living reminder of what meant challenging the honor of a goddess. Medusa, weak and broken, tried to gather strength to speak, to defend himself, to explain that this had not been his fault. But the energy in the temple was relentless, indifferent to human supplications. He knew that something terrible was about to happen, something that would change his life forever. And so, between the shadows and the divine glow, Medusa felt how the weight of the curse began to wrap it, a sentence that did not understand completely, but that would soon be impossible to ignore. The silence of the temple was like a shout content, a void full of tension and omen. Medusa remained on his knees in front of the altar, with his body trembling and his broken heart, unable to process what had just happened. His devotion, his faith, his whole life seemed to have crumbled in an instant. But the worst was to come. Suddenly, the air inside the part became heavy, as if an invisible force compressed everything. A blinding, intense, and golden light began to emanate from the statue of Athena. The marble, which had always been cold and silent, vibrated under Medusa's feet, and the roar of a distant storm seemed to fill the space. It was as if the temple was waking up, responding to the outrage committed inside. Medusa raised her head with fear, her red eyes for crying. I knew what was coming. He could feel it in each fiber of his being. Athena was there. It was not his physical presence, but his essence filled every corner of the place. The statue, before motionless, seemed to come alive. His eyes shone with inhuman intensity, reflecting an anger so deep that the atmosphere became unbearable. You dared to desecrate my temple. The voice echoed in the air, not as a sound, but as a presence that invaded everything. It was the voice of Athena, severe and cold, loaded with a fury that Medusa had never imagined. Each word hit like a wave in a storm, relentless and definitive. Medusa tried to speak, explain, defend. His voice was broken, just a whisper between the echo of the goddess. It wasn't my fault. He finally shouted, his voice full of despair. I didn't want it. I tried to stop him. Please, you know it. But Athena didn't seem to listen to her. His eyes, so full of judgment, remained fixed in Medusa, analyzing it, evaluating it, as if it were one more piece on a board that should be moved to restore balance. For Athena, what had happened was not just an offense against Medusa, it was a direct insult to his power, a challenge to his authority as a goddess of wisdom and justice. What did you swear loyalty? He tried the voice, full of reproach. You, who promised to stay pure and sacred under my protection. You have brought dishonor to this place. Medusa felt as if every word was a blow to the chest. I wanted to shout, I wanted to beg her to understand that she had not done anything wrong, that she was the victim, not to blame for her. But Athena's words were like knives, penetrating her skin and spirit. You can't blame me. he supplied, his eyes full of tears. It was him. Poseidon. He did this to me. I could not stop him. I didn't want to. The face of the statue seemed to harden even more, if that was possible. But behind the divine anger, there was something else, something that Medusa could not decipher. Was it pain? Disappointment? A mixture of both? For Athena, that was not only a personal affront, it was a stain in his temple, a reminder that even the gods could be challenged. You allowed this to happen in my temple, Athena said, his relentless voice. Now, everyone will know the consequences of betraying my trust, of breaking the oath you made before me. Medusa tried to get up, but an invisible force kept it on the ground. It was as if the weight of the goddess' wrath crushed her, making her smaller, more fragile. He wanted to beg once again, but something inside told him it was useless. Athena had already decided his destiny. The light emanating from the statue intensified until it was almost unbearable. Medusa closed her eyes, but the light crossed her eyelids, burning her soul. And then, he felt it. And scorching pain toward his entire body, starting with his scalp. He shouted, a scream that filled the temple and seemed to bounce between the columns. It was as if something inside her was being torn, transformed, deformed. His trembling hands touched his hair, but it was no longer hair. His cry drowned in his throat when he felt movement, life. He opened his eyes and looked at his reflection on the polished marble floor. What he saw left her breath. Where before there were golden strands, now there were snakes, twisting, weather, living. His eyes, formerly sweet and human's, were now cold and penetrating, with a deadly shine that he did not recognize as his. From now on, Athena announced, anyone who dares to look into her eyes will be turned into stone. You will be an eternal reminder of my power, of the consequences of challenging me. And you, a Medusa, will load with this curse until the end of your days. The air suddenly calmed down, but silence did not bring peace. Medusa, now transformed, stayed alone in the temple. The snakes siziated in their head, as if they were a macabre choir that celebrated their misfortune. He looked again at the reflection, trying to recognize the young woman who had been, but all he saw was a monster. The temple, who had been his home, his sanctuary, was now a prison. And Medusa understood, with unbearable pain, that there was no escape. Athena had condemned her to be feared, to be alone, to be remembered not for who she was, but for what she now represented. And so, the temple was silent once again, but this time, the echo of the tragedy would resonate forever on its walls. Medusa will never forget the pain that traveled her at that moment, when her life changed forever, when the goddess Athena, with her cold gaze and her implacable fury, condemned her to an existence that no longer took place in the world she knew. It was such a deep pain, so heartbreaking, that it seemed to tear him out more than his humanity. Something that would not find again. At first, everything it was a sense of heat, a pressure that seized his head. He felt as if the scalp burned, as if an unknown force was starting what had been his throughout his life. Medusa could not see what was happening, but his fingers were the first to realize. They touched their hair, feeling the change, the horror of what was happening. The hair that had been as golden as the sun's rays began to twist, become heavier, and instead of falling with the softness of the waves of the sea, it began to move on its own. Medusa realized, terrified, that he no longer had control over his own body. Each of his hair became a snake, a poisonous and viva creature, whose hisso made her shiver. He felt the rubbing of the scales, the rising movement, and could not avoid a cry drowned with despair. Each of those snakes seemed to nibble his skin, as if his own flesh were betraying her. The pain intensified and extended to his face. His cheekbones sank, and his skin, which had been so soft and bright, became rough and rough, covering himself with spots and scars. Medusa tried to scream, but something was happening in his throat, as if the vocal strings were transforming, altering their ability to emit a human sound. Instead of words, only a whisper, deep and strange, came out, which made his body shudder even more. His eyes, before full of innocence and beauty, became bigger, brighter. The iris darkened, acquiring a golden, intense tone, and the pupils lengthened, as if they no longer had limit. He felt how his vision changed, how he saw the world through a curtain of fury and despair. But the worst was the reflection of herself, the horror she saw in her own face. His lips curved in a grimace of pain, while his skin became a grayish tone, almost as if he were rotting from the inside. Medusa tried to speak, implore, make everything stop, but his voice did not come out. Instead, the air around him seemed to be filled with dense energy, as if the darkness himself was swallowing his being. The physical pain was unbearable, but the worst was the feeling that something much deeper and devastating happened inside. What was left of her? Who was she now? The young priestess, the beautiful mortal who had been admired by all, was now replaced by a monstrous creature, an aberration that she could not recognize herself. But the transformation was not only external. His soul, his spirit, was also being marked by the curse. He felt how the snake poison towed each of his thoughts, how his mind clouded with fury and pain. The purity that once defined his life vanished, as if the same hatred that Athena had deposited in it had leaked in every corner of his being. The anger seized his heart, and could not avoid it. It was as if, in his conviction, he was losing herself. He looked once again towards the altar, towards the statue of Athena, hoping to find a pinch of mercy, but the only thing he saw was the same severe look, the same disapproval. The goddess had not had mercy, and Medusa understood, with a broken heart, that she would never have it. The temple, which had been his sanctuary, was now his prison he could not escape. Not only because of the external curse, but for the horror that had been installed inside, a transformation that had no turning back. The pain in his body calmly calmed down, but what was left was much worse. His soul, his mind, his very essence, had been marked. The beauty that had been his pride, which had inspired so much love and worship, had vanished. His face, now a horror face, was a warning for all those who dared to look at it. The world, who once had seen her as a mortal goddess, would now reject her, fear her, would flee her. Medusa did not know how long had passed when he finally realized what had happened. The curse had not only stolen his beauty, but also his humanity. It was nothing more than a shadow of what had been, a creature condemned to live alone, hidden from everyone's eyes, a monster that could only be feared and hated. His reflection, now deformed and scary, looked at her from the nearby waters. The snakes in his head not only bit his hair, but also bit their soul. And the pain of lost herself, the pain of seeing how her own body had been transformed into an aberration, destroyed her inside. It didn't matter how much he tried to flee, it didn't matter how many times he tried to escape that image, the curse was there, on his face, in his being. Medusa was no longer the young woman who had been, nor the priestess who had sworn loyalty to Athena. Now, it was a Gorgon, condemned to a monster, to live in the dark, alone and separated from the world he once met. Medusa walked, or rather, dragged his deformed body, for the dark and lonely shores of an island that seemed to have no end. The island of Gorgon, so remote, so isolated, that not even the gods dared to visit it. A place forgotten by the world, where the wind only brought echoes of desolation and the waves collided with the rocks rhythmic, as a constant lament, as a reminder that there, in that corner of the world, nobody expected it, nobody remembered it. The sun, who had once kissed her skin softly, now looked at her from above, mercilessly. The golden rays, which previously highlighted their beauty, were now lost among the snakes that curled up in their head, covering it with living shadows. No one would ever see her as before. No one could look at her without being petrified, without being trapped in her gaze, a punishment not only for the unsuspecting, but for herself. The goddess Athena had spoken, and her curse was irrevocable. The sea roared at his feet, but Medusa did not listen to him, since the real torment was not the cold he felt in his body, nor the wind that cut his skin. The real suffering was silence. The loneliness. The condemnation to live in a place where not even monsters, those nightmare beings, approached. The place was full of shadows and creatures that overflowed terror, but none of them dared to approach her. He feared the same nature, rejected her, as if the poison of his curse was contagious. As if she, because of the mere fact, was already a threat to any soul that dared to cross on her way. There was no one there, except her, and the snakes that twisted in her head, always alive, always vigilant. The monsters of the place, some with the body of men and others shaped like grotesque beasts, stayed away, looking from afar. They did not understand her pain, but they recognized her for what she was, so Athena had turned her, a monster that should be avoided at all costs. The sky slowly darkened, and Medusa, with empty eyes, sat in a sharp rock, like a spectrum. His face, before full of life and hope, was now a mask of despair. The snakes that grew from their head sizzlated in a whisper of sadness, as if they also felt the weight of the condemnation. Medusa hugged herself, wishing to undo time. She would like to be able to return to those moments where her life had a purpose. To those days in the temple of Athena, where all I had known was worship and devotion. But now, all that seemed so distant, as unreal, as a dream lost in the fog. From time to time, the wind brought with it the echoes of the men who crossed the sea, travelers who only knew stories of monsters and legends. Medusa felt her steps approaching, and fear flooded her, the fear of looking at her, the fear of being seen, the fear that some of them would dare to face her. Because she knew what was happening when someone looked at her. They became stone, and Medusa, even if they understood the reason, no longer endured the tragedy he had unleashed. Gorgon Island was a place that represented everything he had already lost: his beauty, his humanity, his love, his hope. She was condemned to live there, in an exile that erased her from the world, which condemned her to the deepest of the solitudes. What could you do in such a place? What could expect from life when not even heaven, neither the earth, nor the gods looked at her? Every day was equal to the previous one. The days slid as shadows, and the nights fell with the same coldness, full of distant stars that never seemed as distant as the suffering he felt. I could not remember the last moment I had seen the face of another being, human or divine. Time, there, seemed not to exist. Medusa no longer knew if he still lived in the world of mortals or if he had entered an eternal limbo, where the only company was the constant saddle of the snakes that surrounded her, her only witness in that endless nightmare. His soul was broken, his body was just a shadow of the being that had been. Gorgon Island did not offer comfort, or rest. It was a place made for monsters, for lost souls, and Medusa had no idea how long it had spent since it was sent there. The passing of the days was a whisper in his mind, a cold breeze that caressed his skin indifferently. It didn't matter. But even, in his deepest solitude, Medusa clung to a thought, even if he did it with little hope, the belief that one day, someone, in some corner of that world, could understand what had really happened. Someone who, despite her monstrosity, saw in her the woman who had been before the curse. But that hope faded. P-Orc knew, deep down, that hope was just a distant echo, a whisper drowned by the infinite distance that now separated her from everything. The island of Gorgon, with its monsters and its loneliness, hugged her, and Medusa, trapped in her conviction, was lost in the shadows. The beauty that once was her light, was now her conviction, and the horror that surrounded her, her only company. Exile was a punishment beyond the evil he had experienced. It was death in life, the oblivion of a world that no longer remembered it. Loneliness was a silence that was never leaving, a vacuum that surrounded Medusa as a shadow. On the island of Gorgona, each dawn was equal to the previous one, a desolate landscape, sharp rocks, and the echo of its own breathing. The snakes in their heads sizzlated gently, as if they were trying to fill the silence, but they did not succeed. It was a constant, familiar sound, which sometimes seemed the only proof that I was still alive. But at the bottom of his soul, Medusa was not sure, wanting to continue living. The isolation was his prison, but also his only refuge. Far from human eyes, far from the looks that transformed anyone who dared to cross with her, Medusa was protected. There were no laugh to envy, or look to endure, but there were no words to comfort her. The only language he had left was the whisper of the snakes, the roar of the wind, and the breaking of the waves against the rocks. At first, he tried to cry, believing that perhaps tears would relieve her. But I couldn't. Athena had not only transformed his body, but seemed to have ripped out of it the ability to cry, to release the pain he carried inside. Every time he tried, he only felt the pressure on his chest, as if the suffering was trapped, without escape. It was a constant, suffocating pain, which sometimes made her kneel, with closed fists and tightened teeth. The crying that could not spill became shouting, drowned whispers, in sighs that nobody listened. Over time, pain became something darker, deeper. Medusa began to feel the anger to grow inside her, a fury that fed on each memory of every injustice. Anger did not need words or explanations, he was simply there, beating in his chest, like a fire that could not be extinguished. He enraged with Athena for his cruelty, for blaming and punishing her for something he had not chosen. She was enraged with Poseidon, whose pride and desire had condemned her. But above all, he enraged himself, because he could not stop remembering the woman he had been, the beauty he had once considered a gift, but now he saw as a curse. The anger accompanied her on the longest nights, when the sky was covered with stars that seemed to make fun of her suffering. Sometimes he shouted towards the sky, challenging the gods who had forgotten her. His voice echoed on the island, and the creatures that lived in the distance hid, fearful of approaching. Medusa was a force that they could not understand, a mixture of pain and fury that did not take place in the world of mortals or that of the gods. The days became weeks, the weeks in months. He learned to survive in his solitude. The island offered him what was necessary: bitter fruits, cold water from springs that ran between the rocks. But his true learning was not about how to live, but about how to reject. Every time a traveler approached the island, guided by stories or by chance, Medusa felt them before seeing them. I listened to the creak of the steps, the sound of human voices, and a mixture of emotions invaded her: fear, anger, and something that he did not want to admit, a hint of hope. But that hope died as fast as it came. Medusa knew what would happen if someone looked at her. He knew that his face was a weapon, a punishment that he couldn't avoid. Therefore, when he felt someone's presence, he did the only thing he knew how to do: scare away. He shouted with a voice that resonated like thunder, threw stones towards the sound of his steps, let the snakes whistle and show their fangs. Some fled instantly, terrified by the rumors of the Gorgona. Others, more brave or more foolish, tried to approach, and for those, the tragedy was inevitable. The first time someone was petrified in front of her, Medusa felt a mixture of horror and emptiness. I hadn't wanted to do it. He had not asked to have this power. But there was, in front of her, a statue of what had previously been a man. He didn't know him, he didn't know why he had reached his island, but now it was just stone, caught in a surprise and fear pose, with his eyes open as if he could still see. Medusa backed away, feeling nausea, but could not stop looking. That was the moment when he completely understood the scope of his conviction. Not only was she destined to live in solitude, established to destroy anything that will approach it. The anger returned, stronger than ever. "Why me?" He shouted at heaven, but there was no answer. The gods remained silent, indifferent to their suffering. Loneliness and anger were their only companions, and over time, they began to define it. His heart, which had ever been soft and full of love for life, was now hardened. Each visitor who tried to approach was rejected, with shouts, with stones, with his mortal gaze, until the island itself became a place feared by all. But on the darkest nights, when everything was silent and the stars seemed to look at her from the top, Medusa could not help asking himself if that anger that was also holding her was consuming her. If perhaps, in his effort to reject the world, he was losing herself, becoming something worse than a monster, a broken spirit, unable to feel nothing more than the weight of her own condemnation. The stories about Medusa began as murmurs, small echoes that extended from the confines of the sea to the most populous coasts of Greece. At first, nobody believed in them. They looked like stories invented by drunk sailors or travelers who had lost course in the vast ocean. But as is the case with all the legends, the rumors grew, deformed, and became something bigger, somewhat more scary. Medusa was no longer just a name, it was an omen, a synonym for death and horror. In taverns and markets, the voices of the narrators rose, full of drama. "They say that his gaze can become stone instantly," said one, with his eyes open as if he had witnessed the event himself. "His hair is living snakes, which are twisted and whistled as heralds of death," another added, while the public shuddered. It was impossible not to feel a chill when they heard these words, even if they were pronounced in the middle of the bustle of everyday life. The fishermen, who once sailed near the island of Gorgona, began to avoid it. Even the bravest preferred to surround the dangerous waters, although that would mean additional days on the high seas. "There inhabits a monster," they said, with a warning tone. "No one who has set foot on that island has returned alive." Some swore to have seen the petrified statues of men on the shore, with frozen terror expressions forever. Others claimed that the winds themselves carried the snakes, a sound that could freeze the blood. The stories reached the courts of the kings, where the bards adorned them with darker and fantastic details. "It is the punishment of a goddess," they whispered. "A woman who challenged the gods and paid the highest price. Now, its existence is a curse for anyone who finds it." Some added that it was not simply a monster, but a vindictive creature which stalked men from the shadows, hoping to turn them into stone for the simple pleasure of doing so. But what nobody understood, what none of them could know, was the truth behind those rumors. Medusa did not look for victims, he did not chase men or hunt them. Each statue that left in his path was a reminder of his pain, a silent scream of despair. However, the perception of mortals could not capture that. For them, she was an impious being, an aberration that should be feared and avoided at all costs. Rumors not only filled the ears of common men, they also woke up somewhat darker in the heart of the warriors and heroes. Those who sought glory and recognition saw in Medusa an opportunity. If they managed to defeat her, if they could end such a feared being, their names would be remembered forever. But none of them understood what they really faced. None understood that looking at Medusa was to look at his own death. Some arrived on the island of Gorgon, driven by their ambition or arrogance. Their swords and shields shone under the sun, and their hearts were full of courage, but all that crumbled at the moment they saw their face. The courage was transformed into panic, and panic froze in stone. The island became a cemetery of statues, each with a story that would never be told. Medusa did not celebrate these deaths. Each of them was a reminder of its own tragedy, one more weight to add to the burden of its existence. In towns and cities, rumors continued to grow, fed by collective imagination. People began to fear even speaking their name, as if mentioning it could invoke it. The children were warned not to look into the eyes of strangers, and travelers were instructed to avoid any island they did not know. The terror became palpable, a shadow that spread over Greece like a dark cloud. But not everything those who listened to these stories felt fear. For some, especially for those who were considered favored by the gods, Medusa was nothing more than a test. An obstacle that, with divine help, could overcome. These men prepared with weapons and prayers, believing that their faith and courage would be enough to face it. They didn't know that Medusa was not a simple monster. They did not understand that what they faced was not only a damned creature, but to a woman whose humanity had been destroyed, whose life had been stolen. Medusa, in her exile, did not know to what extent the fear towards her had grown up. But I felt it in the air, in the way the few travelers arriving at the island trembled before perishing. He felt the weight of the legend that was built around him, and that filled her with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He was no longer seen as a person, like someone who had suffered an injustice. For the world, it was just a monster, a name that whispered with fear. The loneliness that already consumed it became even more with this perception. There was no hope of redemption, or possibility that someone would understand it. Everything that remained was the fear of mortals, a fear that grew with every day that passed. A fear that separated her even more from the world, condemning her, forever, the creature that everyone feared but nobody understood. Loneliness was no longer his only partner. Now, resentment grew in Medusa as a fire that could not turn off. Sitting in the rocks of the island of Gorgona, with the snakes of his hair waving restless, Medusa watched the horizon, that place where the sky was with the sea. It was a vast and indifferent landscape, as distant and cruel as the gods that had condemned her. His thoughts were a whirlwind of memories and emotions. He remembered his ancient life, his beauty, his devotion to Athena. He had been a young woman full of faith, believing that the gods protected those who served them, that divine justice was real. But that faith had broken in the most brutal way, leaving an abyss full of unanswered questions. Why had they punished her? Why was she who carried Athena's wrath, while Poseidon, the real culprit, was still free, untouchable, as if nothing had happened? Rabies filled his chest every time he thought about the indifference of the gods. They, so powerful, so arrogant, had not hesitated to destroy their life for their own whims. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who had admired so much, had not shown any mercy. Instead of protecting her after the outrage she had suffered, she had made her a monster, a being who could never look at another living being without condemning him to death. It was a cruel, unfair punishment that I could not understand or accept. Athena was the first in his thoughts, the one that fed his resentment the most. What kind of justice was that? What kind of goddess punished her victim instead of the aggressor? Medusa pressed her fist so strong that the nails stuck in her palms. He had sworn chastity in his honor, had dedicated his life to the temple, and even so, all that had not meant anything. The anger mixed with sadness, a sadness so deep that sometimes I felt that I could not breathe. But it was not just Athena. All the gods shared the same guilt in Medusa's eyes. Poseidon, with his arrogance and lack of control, had acted as if his desire was an unquestionable law. He had taken what he wanted without thinking about the consequences, knowing that his divine position would protect him from any punishment. Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Artemisa, they were all the same. All were superior beings who played with the life of mortals as if they were pawns on a board. The mortals suffered their whims, and they, the Olympics, remained untouchable, elevated on their eternal throne, laughing at the destroyed destinations. The nights were the darkest moments for Medusa, not only because the island was wrapped in shadows, but because her mind was filled with thoughts that torn her inside. He looked at the stars, those same stars who had witnessed his suffering, and wondered how it was possible that heaven was so beautiful while his life was so miserable. Sometimes, in his despair, he shouted towards the sky, words full of bitterness and challenge. "Arrogant gods!" he shouted, his voice breaking the silence of the night. "Is this what you call justice? So you show your greatness, destroying those who cannot defend themselves?" The snakes in their head stirred more intensely when their fury reached their maximum point, as if they shared their anger. It was a constant reminder of what the gods had done to him. I could not escape it, not even in moments of calm. Each movement, every whisper of those creatures, was una proof of his transformation, of the injustice he had suffered. Sometimes, in his isolation, Medusa wondered if his hatred towards the gods was consuming her. But soon he ruled out those thoughts. What else could feel? He had lost everything, his home, his humanity, his life. All that remained was that burning fury, that resentment that refused to disappear. If I let that hatred go, what would look about it? Nothing. It was the only thing that kept her standing, the only thing that gave meaning to her existence. However, hatred was not a passive emotion. It grew and extended as deep roots inside. He began to imagine what the gods would be like, what would be to return the suffering they had caused. I dreamed of the day I could look at Athena, not as a humiliated servant, but as an equal, as someone capable of challenging their power. He fantasized with the fall of Poseidon, with the moment when her arrogance would cost her what she had cost. But they were just fantasies, thoughts that could not become a reality. The gods were untouchable, and she was trapped on that island, condemned to loneliness. That, perhaps, was the most desperate of everything, impotence. His hatred was great, but he had no way to express it, to free him. It was a fire that burned inside her, but could not burn anything but her own soul. Every day that passed, Medusa moved away more from the woman she had been. His humanity faded, replaced by that monster that the gods had created. But deep down, in the darkest corner of his being, a small spark of desire was still alive. It was not a desire for forgiveness or redemption. It was a desire for justice, revenge. And although I knew that I would probably never have the opportunity to face the gods, that spark was enough to keep it alive. In the inhospitable island of Gorgon, where loneliness seemed to be the only inhabitant, Medusa was not completely alone. There were two figures that shared their exile, two presences that, although they could not alleviate their pain at all, offered a link with something bigger than their suffering, their sisters, Steno and Euryale. They were the other two Gorgons, immortals and wild, so different and, at the same time, so similar to it. Steno and Euryale had been born monstrous from the beginning, unlike Medusa, who was once a mortal woman. They were daughters of Phorcys and Ceto, primordial gods of the sea, and carried in their skin and in their form the mark of the inhuman from the day they opened their eyes. However, despite their immortal and fearsome nature, these sisters were not simply creatures, they were guardians, protective and, above all, family. Its existence was linked to that of Medusa, not by choice, but by a bond that even the gods could break. When Medusa arrived on the island, transformed, damned and broken, Steno and Euryale received it without questions or reproaches. They didn't need words to understand what had happened. His eyes, so different from those of mortals, saw beyond the visible. They saw the pain, fury, and injustice that Medusa carried as a second skin. But they also saw something else, to their sister. They did not repudiate it for their new shape or for the snakes that now lived in their head. For them, Medusa was still Medusa, even if their humanity had been taken away. Steno was the greatest, strong and fierce as a storm. His indomitable character made her almost invulnerable, and perhaps it was. Of the three sisters, she was the bloodiest, the one who did not hesitate to use her strength to protect what she considered her. But under that hardness, there was a deep love for his sisters. Although he was not someone of many words, his presence was always a reminder that, on that island of Soledad, no one could threaten Medusa without facing his fury first. Euryale, on the other hand, was the most emotional. There was a sensitivity that contrasted with its monstrous appearance. His eyes, although terrifying for mortals, had a depth that spoke of a heart capable of feeling everything with an almost painful intensity. Euryale cried through Medusa when he could not do it. He cried for injustice, for the cruelty of the gods, and for all that his sister had lost. But it was also a warrior, and that sadness never made her less lethal. Euryale protected Medusa not only with his strength, but with his love. The three sisters formed a strange circle in the center of the island. They were, in many ways, all they had. The outside world feared, hated them, and considered them monsters. But among them there was no space for that contempt. His link was a shelter, a small flame amid an endless storm. And although Medusa carried the weight of his curse as an unbearable burden, he found some comfort in the unwavering loyalty of his sisters. Sometimes, during the length nights, the three sat together on the rocks, under the sky full of stars. They didn't talk much, the words were not necessary. Steno sharpened his claws against the stones, as he looked at the horizon with his eyes full of thoughts he never expressed. Medusa, at that time, allowed a brief respite from his anger and his resentment. In the presence of his sisters, the monster in which he had become seemed to go back, even if it were only a little. However, their relationship was not free of tensions. There was something that separated them, something they never said out loud, but that floated between them as a shadow. Medusa was different. She was not immortal as Steno and Euryale. His condition was an imposition, a cruelty that had been launched by divine whim. And although their sisters loved her, they couldn't completely understand their pain. They were born as they were, while Medusa had been transformed, torn from their deadly and thrown into a destination he had never chosen. Steno, in particular, found it difficult to understand the emotional vulnerability of Medusa. For her, the solution was always strength, confrontation. "The gods fear us," he used to say, in the voice full of conviction. "That's why they hate us. We owe anything to them, neither respect nor supplication." But Medusa could not share that feeling. His hatred towards the gods was deep, yes, but he was also died of a pain that he could not experiment. It was an abyss that separated them, although they never admitted it. Euryale, on the other hand, tried to be the bridge between them. He understood the ferocity of Steno and the despair of Medusa, but also knew that, in the end, they were all trapped in the same tragedy. On more than one occasion, he had tried to comfort Medusa, stroking the snakes of his hair with a tenderness that seemed impossible in someone of his appearance. But even in courage, with all his empathy, he could not relieve the emptiness that Medusa felt inside. Over time, the sisters became not only Medusa protectors, but also protectors of the territory they shared. Any mortal sufficiently foolish to approach the island was an inevitable destination. Steno and Euryale were relentless in their defense, making sure that no one arrived in Medusa without facing them first. And although Medusa did not say it, there was something comforting in knowing that, even in his monstrosity, he was not completely alone. "The sisters were a reminder of what I had lost," but also what I still had. They were a reflection of what the gods could not destroy, a stronger link than the curse, a connection that even time or tragedy could break. The island of Gorgona, with its imposing cliffs and its atmosphere full of mystery, became the epicenter of legends that crossed seas and mountains. The echoes of the name of Medusa were traveling from village in village, whispered with fear and reverence, as if naming it were enough to invoke its anger. The few who had heard stories from those who dared to face her knew there was no going back. Entering his domain was to accept death. The stories were always the same, although the details vary according to who told them. Warriors, glory hunters, and men eager to make a name, departed towards the island with hearts full of courage, or perhaps arrogance. None returned. In the best case, their ships were found empty, drift floating. In the worst, those who approached too much to the coasts of the island discovered terrifyingly realistic sculptures, men with expressions of eternal horror, frozen at the exact moment in which their bodies had succumbed to Medusa's gaze. One of the most repeated stories was that of the young Ares Tun, a warrior known for his ability with the spear and his pride without limits. He had proclaimed in the agora of his city that he did not fear the monsters, that Medusa's head would be the trophy that would decorate the doors of his home. Armed with weapons forged by the best blacksmiths and accompanied by a crew of brave men, he left for the cursed island. His mother, in the farewell, cried in silence, while he assured that he would become triumphant. Weeks later, a fisherman found Ariston's ship near the coast of a neighboring island. It was empty, with torn candles and oars floating around it. But the most disturbing thing was what he discovered when he approached the island of Gorgon Moor, a row of stone figures on the edge of the forest, as if they had tried to escape and had been trapped in the act. Ares Tun was among them, his frozen face in a grimace of disbelief and terror. His spear, which had once been his pride, lay down at his feet, moss-covered. But Ares Tun was not the only one. Over time, more men tried to face Medusa, each with their own motivations. Some sought glory, others wealth, and a few, redemption. They all shared the same destination. One of the most tragic was that of Callisthenes, a war veteran who had lost his family during a pirate looting. He had heard that Medusa's head could be used as a weapon, and in his despair, he thought he could use it to protect the innocents. However, when he stepped on the island, neither his experience nor his noble purpose were enough to save him. The villagers and travelers who told these stories added details that increased horror and mystery. They said that, as one entered the island, he could feel how life itself seemed to fade. The trees, although alive, seemed grey, as if they had absorbed the despair of those who walked under their shadow. The winds whispered warnings, or perhaps were the regrets of those who had fallen victims of Medusa's gaze. And always, in the end, she was waiting in the heart of the island, as a shadow that could not be confronted. What nobody knew was that Medusa did not look for these meetings. He did not hunt the men who entered their territory, he simply waited in his shelter, in the depths of the island, isolated and resigned to his destiny. His curse was not only his transformation, but also to be the object of these stories, of these desperate attempts of those who did not understand their tragedy. Every man who fell to his gaze was a new burden for his already tormented soul. Sometimes, while walking among the statues that now decorated their island, Medusa felt unbearable pain. He did not know the names of these men, nor their stories, but saw in their faces the humanity he had ever shared. Some seemed terrified, other challenging ones, and a few had expressions that almost seemed peaceful, as if they had accepted their destiny at the last moment. Medusa, with the snakes of his hair eating gently, looked at those figures with something that was neither hate or indifference, but such a deep sadness that was almost tangible. Over time, the rumors about Medusa and his island became more scary. It was said that the statues were not simply remains of petrified men, but that, in some way, their souls were trapped in the stone, condemned to wander the island as invisible shadows. Others claimed that Medusa could hear their victims' last thoughts before they succumbed, and that those thoughts tormented her night after night. Despite the warnings, there was always someone willing to try, someone who believed it would be different, who would achieve what no one had achieved. But with each new failure, with each new statue that joined the ranks of the convicted, the legend of Medusa grew, feeding on fear and tragedy. His name became synonymous with terror, but also of power, a reminder that even the bravest could not challenge what was beyond the human. And so, the island of Gorgon remained silent, but never at peace. Each statue was a testimony of the tragedy of Medusa, not only of his curse, but also of the endless cycle of men who sought to destroy it without understanding the true horror of its existence. In the cities near the island of Gorgona, the existence of Medusa became a shadow that extended beyond the seas, influencing the lives of mortals even without having set foot in their lands. His name was pronounced in whispers, as if mentioning it out loud could invoke his presence. The fishermen who worked near the island warned about danger with gestures and short words, and mothers used their history to scare restless children before sleeping. Without realizing, Medusa ceased to be just a myth, it became a symbol, an echo of fear that resonated in every corner of the mortal world. The markets, always bustling, were filled with rumors about the monster of the deadly look. The street narrators adorned their stories with fantastic details to attract the attention of the curious. Some claimed to have seen the island from afar, wrapped in an impenetrable fog, where the shadows of the petrified statues seemed to move with the wind. Others said that the song of Medusa snakes could be heard on the quietest nights, as a reminder of their eternal curse. These legends not only fed fear, but also a kind of fascination that was impossible to ignore. The bravest, or the most foolish, organized expeditions to find evidence of their existence, while artists were inspired by their history to create sculptures, painted and mosaic vessels that decorated temples and homes. Medusa, a figure that did not ask or sought the attention of the world, became an icon of horror and power. It was feared, yes, but also venerated, in a twisted way. In the cities closest to Gorgona, its influence was even more palpable. The fishermen avoided getting too close to their waters, and the few who ventured swore to have seen flashes of something alive among the shadows of the cliffs. Some claimed that the presence of Medusa altered nature itself. They said that the water around the island seemed darker, heavier, as if the curse of Athena permeated until the last corner of the place. The fish were scarce, and the few who trapped near the territory had a bitter taste, as if they had also been touched by misfortune. Women, in particular, felt a strange and contradictory connection with the figure of Medusa. Some saw her as a reminder of what could happen if they challenged the norms imposed by the gods or men. For others, it was a warning of the fragility of mortality, how even the most beautiful and devoted could be destroyed by forces outside its control. But there were also those who, in the silence of their thoughts, found in Medusa a kind of resistance symbol. In spite of everything he had lost, there was still indomitable, unattainable on his island. On the other hand, cities' leaders saw in Medusa more than a myth, they considered it a real threat to their territories and their people. The priests in the temples warned that their presence was a punishment of the gods, a proof that deities were always vigilant and willing to act when mortals forgot their place. Some even promoted ceremonies and sacrifices to appease the anger of Athena, believing that perhaps they could protect themselves from the influence of the Gorgona. In contrast, there were those who saw a chance in the fear that Medusa inspired. Unscrupulous merchants began selling amulets that allegedly protected against their gaze, while charlatans claimed to have stone fragments of the island's petrified statues. It was even said that some people paid fortunes to the few returned from the vicinity of Gorgona with stories of what they had seen, although no one could try if those stories were real or invented. But the deepest impact was not on markets or temples, but in the hearts of common people. The existence of Medusa, real or not, was a reminder of the fragility of humanity to the divine. The families who lost their sons and daughters in expeditions to the island cried bitterly, cursing the gods for allowing such monstrosity. Young people, eager to demonstrate their courage, fell into the trap of believing that they could face something that was beyond their understanding. And the elders, who had heard these stories all their lives, simply looked at the horizon, knowing that the world would always find new ways of scaring and punishing mortals. Meanwhile, on the island, Medusa remained oblivious to the magnitude of its impact on the outside world. His life was limited by his exile, his loneliness, and the constant fight against his own identity. The echoes of the legends that surrounded her did not reach her ears, but the consequences of her curse extended as circles in the water, touching lives kilometers away. Each petrified look, each man transformed into stone, fed not only fear, but also an almost morbid curiosity to understand this creature that, without wishing it, had left an indelible mark on the world of mortals. And while the weather advanced, the name of Medusa did not fade, on the contrary, it grew, wrapping everything in its path with the mixture of horror, tragedy, and fascination that only a figure like her could inspire. In Olympus, where time seemed to flow differently, the gods watched the deadly world with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Athena, sitting on her shining marble throne, kept her eyes on the horizon, as if the chaos of the world were little more than a minor distraction. Around him, the echo of the divine conversations resonated with a constant rhythm: intrigues, disputes, bets. But, in the midst of everything, the figure of Medusa persisted as a dissonant note, a piece of a game that nobody dared to recognize completely. Athena was not a goddess who would easily be given to human emotions. His countenance remained impassive while observing the effects of his curse on the creature that had once served in his temple with devotion. There was no regret in his eyes or regrets in his heart. For her, Medusa was now little more than a reminder of what was happening when mortals and gods crossed prohibited lines. The offense Poseidon in his temple had been an affront to his honor, but the punishment imposed on Medusa was, in his opinion, divine justice. In Athena's logic, order should prevail, and the fate of Medusa was nothing more than a necessary consequence. However, his indifference was not as simple as it seemed. Sometimes, when the rumors of mortals on the Gorgon reached their ears, an almost imperceptible shadow crossed his face. It was not pity, not even anger, but something deeper, something buried under layers of pride and divinity. Perhaps, in the darkest corners of his mind, Athena knew that Medusa's story was not only a deadly tragedy, but also a scar in her own domain, a proof that even the gods could act impulsively, blinded by pride. Poseidon, on the other hand, seemed to completely ignore the consequences of his actions. In the vast oceans he ruled, his laugh resonated among the waves while directed storms and calmed seas according to his whim. The god of the sea was no stranger to the rumors about Medusa, but for him, the Gorgona was nothing more than a distant echo, an irrelevant detail in its endless search for dominance and power. If he ever thought about the suffering he had caused, he hid him under layers of arrogance and disdain. Between Athena and Poseidon, the rivalry was still alive, like a fire that never went out. Each small act in the mortal world was a silent declaration of war between them. When Athena protected a city, Poseidon sent storms to prove her resistance. When Poseidon demanded a new port, Athena sent visions to the leaders to warn them of their influence. And at the bottom of all this, Medusa remained as a forgotten pawn, a piece sacrificed on a board where the gods moved chips regardless of the consequences. The Olympus, with its impeccable beauty and its eternally clear skies, was witnessing these divine games. The other gods observed, sometimes with interest, sometimes with indifference, how Athena and Poseidon played their endless game. Zeus, sitting in the center of the pantheon, raised an eyebrow from time to time, but rarely intervened. For him, disputes between his children were inevitable, and as long as they did not threaten the general balance, he preferred not to get involved. However, not all gods shared this apathy. Hermes, the cunning and curious messenger, occasionally ventured into the deadly world to collect stories and closely observe how the curse of Athena affected not only Medusa, but also the men and women who lived under the shadow of their legend. Sometimes he returned with stories that he shared mocking, enjoying the chaos that the gods had inadvertently unleashed. Other times, he was silent, as if even he, with his irreverent spirit, felt that Medusa's tragedy deserved more than laughter. But it wasn't just Hermes who noticed Medusa. Apollo, the god of the sun, looked towards Gorgona's island as he was guided his float for heaven. Although he never admitted it, there was something in the solitude of Medusa that disturbed him. Artemisa, her sister, with her love for nature and wild spaces, sometimes sent animals to the island, as if in a silent act of compassion she seemed to relieve the loneliness of the Gorgona. Even Hades, in the depths of the underworld, recognized the weight of the curse that Athena had imposed and the injustice he represented. But the gods were, in the end, immortal and immutable. His interest in Medusa's destiny was passenger, a small detour in his eternal lives. For them, mortals and their tragedies were ephemeral, interchangeable pieces on a board where the only thing that mattered was the power and permanence of their domain. Athena and Poseidon continued their dispute, using the history of Medusa as a weapon, a reminder of who had prevailed in the past and who would try to prevail in the future. On the island of Gorgona, far from Olympus, Medusa was still breathing, resisting, living. He did not know that the gods watched her from the heights, nor that her existence was a point of tension in the Athena and Poseidon games. But, perhaps, if I had known, I would have felt a sharp satisfaction. Because although they had condemned her to oblivion and exile, although they had transformed her into a monster, she was still an impossible presence to ignore, even for those who believed themselves invulnerable. In the shadows of the great temples and in the squares of the city-states, rumors about Medusa became an irresistible challenge for the boldest, or the most reckless heroes. The Gorgon, with her gaze capable of petrifying anyone, was a supreme proof of courage. Defeat her not only promised immortal fame and glory, but also the possibility of claiming a unique trophy, her head, such a powerful weapon that could match the strength of the same gods. In the taverns of Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, the names of those who dared to face Medusa were repeated as legends in formation. The bards immortalized them in epic songs before even starting in their mission. Warriors with reckless hearts and eyes full of ambition rose from their seats, raised their glasses, and swore that they would return victorious. Some made it driven by the desire to record their name in history, others, by the fervor of the crowds that encouraged them with applause and cheers. But what everyone shared was a fatal ignorance of the magnitude of what they faced. The first to leave was a young prince named Timon. He was the youngest son of a minor king, eager to demonstrate that his name deserved a place among the greats. Full of trust, he appeared at the Apollo temple to ask for blessings before embarking towards Gorgon Island. The priests looked at him with a heavy silence, aware that his prayers could not protect him from what was to come. Timon came out with an arrogant smile, promising to return with Medusa's head as proof of his courage. He never returned. After Timon, others came. Tanned warriors in battles, tournament champions, and even simple peasants who dreamed of changing their destiny. Each one ventured towards the island with shiny armor, sharp swords, and hearts full of hope. But fate was cruel, and the island of Gorgon, ruthless. Some were petrified before even seeing Medusa's face, others disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the shadows of a place that did not forgive the boldness. The mortal world began to fill with warning stories. It was said that the statues that surrounded the island were not simple rocks, but the remains of the heroes who had fallen under the gaze of the Gorgon. The fishermen who approached too much had to have seen motionless human figures, frozen in horror postures, as if they had tried to flee at the last moment. These stories did not dissuade the bravest, but fed their ambition. Because, for them, the greater the danger, the greater the reward. One of the most renowned warriors who tried to face Medusa was Aelio, a veteran of the Peloponnese Wars. He was known for his skill in battle and his contempt for death. Armed with a shield adorned with the Zeus emblem and a sword forged in the fire of Hephaestus, Aelius gathered a small fleet and sailed to Gorgona. The poets sang on their courage even before it left, describing it as a man destined to succeed where others had failed. But his destiny was the same as that of all those who had preceded him. His shield was found years later, covered with moss on the coast of a nearby island, but there was no trace from him. As the stories of failures accumulated, the figure of Medusa rose even more, not as a simple monster, but as an unwavering force that challenged the arrogance of mortals. The heroes who left for Gorgona not only sought to defeat her, they sought to challenge the impossible, to demonstrate that they could even overcome the designs of the gods. But every failed attempt reinforced the idea that Medusa was more than a physical challenge. It was a divine punishment, a test that nobody could overcome. However, not all who ventured towards Medusa did it for glory. There were those who saw in it a representation of injustice, a being that had been convicted of something out of their control. These few, although rare, left for Gorgon not with the intention of killing her, but with the hope of finding answers. They wanted to understand what really happened, discover if there was a way to free Medusa from his curse. But their good intentions did not save them from the destination that awaited anyone who dared to enter their territory. And in the midst of all this madness, Medusa remained in his exile, increasingly isolated from the world, but never forgotten. She did not know the names of the men who tried to kill her, nor the songs that the bards composed in her honor. The only thing he knew was the silence that preceded each new confrontation, the sound of the wind between the snakes of his hair, and the inevitable arrival of another figure that looked at her with fear and fury before becoming stone. For mortals, she was a myth, a monster, a legend. For the gods, it was a reminder of their power and the consequences of their actions. But for Medusa, everything was a circle of suffering and loneliness, a cycle that seemed to have no end. Each hero that came behind her was a reminder that her existence was nothing more than a cruel game, a piece on a board where human ambition and divine indifference were found. Perseus was a young man rocked by fate from the moment he first breathed. Son of Danae, the princess of Argos, and Zeus, the king of the gods, his life had been full of adversities even before his birth. Acrisio, Perseus's grandfather, had tried to avoid his arrival in the world by locking Danae in a bronze tower, fearing the prophecy that announced that his grandson would kill him. But the designs of the gods always find their way. Zeus, in the form of golden rain, penetrated the walls of the confinement and, with it, began the history of the hero that would face Medusa. Since childhood, Perseus had learned to load with the weight of his divine lineage. Although he grew away from the luxuries of a court, on a remote island where Danae was exiled along with him, his spirit was marked by a mixture of curiosity, courage and, sometimes, a painful yearning for understanding his place in a world where the mortals and the gods interacted so cruelly. He was neither completely human nor divine, and this duality did so much a threat and a promise. The story that would lead him to face Medusa began like so many other Greek tragedies, with pride, jealousy, and manipulation. Polydectes, the king of Seraphs, wanted Danae and saw Perseus as an obstacle to his ambitions. To get rid of the young man, he organized a banquet and, taking advantage of the occasion, challenged him in front of everyone present to make an impossible feat, bring the head of Medusa. Polydectes presented it as a gesture of courage and honor, but in reality it was a trap, an attempt to send Perseus to a safe death. Perseus, young and full of determination, accepted the challenge without fully understanding the magnitude of the task. The Gorgona was not any monster, it was a being that even the gods treated cautiously. But its acceptance did not go unnoticed in Olympus. Athena, always attentive to movements in the mortal world, saw an opportunity in Perseus. Perhaps it was a means to clean the stain that the history of Medusa had left in its legacy, or perhaps it was a way to reaffirm its authority over Poseidon and its monstrous creation. Whatever his motivation, he decided to intervene. Athena was not alone in your interest. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, also got involved. With his cunning and his playful spirit, he saw the mission of Perseus as an opportunity to alter the balance of things, to demonstrate that even mortals could change the course of destiny with a little divine help. Together, Athena and Hermes appeared before Perseus, not as benevolent gods, but as allies with their own interests. He was offered tools to face the challenge, each carefully chosen to increase his chances of success. The Hades helmet, which would grant the invisibility. Hermes' winged sandals, to carry it faster than any other human being. And most importantly, a polished bronze shield, bright as a mirror, which would protect him from the petrifica of Medusa. Athena explained that she should never look directly into the eyes of the Gorgona, instead, he had to use the reflection of the shield to face it. Perseus listened carefully, his mind already starting to plan the steps that would take him to the island of Gorgona. But before facing Medusa, Perseus had to find something else, the Grace, the old sisters of the Gorgons, who shared a single eye and a single tooth. They were the guardians of knowledge about the exact location of Medusa. The search for Perseus would lead him to face his cunning and manipulate them to obtain the information he needed. It was not an act of force, but of ingenuity, a feature that distinguished it from other heroes. Perseus's mission was not only proof of his courage, but also a reflection of conflicts between the gods. Athena and Hermes pushed him towards success, but Poseidon's shadow remained silent. Although it did not intervene directly, its creation, Medusa, was still a key piece on the board. Each step that Perseus gave towards the island of Gorgona was also a step in the eternal game of power among the Olympics. In Perseus' heart, there was a mixture of emotions that driven him forward, the desire to demonstrate his worth, the need to protect his mother from Polydectes and, deep down, a curiosity to understand what he really meant to face a being like Medusa. I did not see the Gorgon as a monster, for him, it was an obstacle that he had to overcome, a mission to comply with. He still did not understand the layers of tragedy and injustice that they wrapped the figure of Medusa, or how their history was intrinsically linked to the struggles of the gods that supported him. Every step that took it closer not only to the confrontation with Medusa, but also to a deeper truth about the gods, mortals, and the delicate balance between them. Perseus did not know, but his mission would be more than an act of heroism. It would be a moment that would change the course of his life and history itself, leaving a mark that would resonate both in the deadly world and in Olympus. Athena watched from her throne at Olympus, with her eyes fixed on the young Perseus. For the goddess of wisdom and strategy, everything was a chess game. Each piece had its purpose, and each movement was carefully calculated to serve its own interests. Medusa had been a stain in her reputation, a reminder that even a goddess like her could lose control. Now I saw in Perseus the opportunity to amend that dark chapter and, at the same time, reaffirm his power in the delicate balance of the gods. When Perseus accepted the challenge of Polydectes, Athena saw her chance. He was young, brave, but also inexperienced. He had no idea of the real danger he faced, and that made him moldable, a perfect tool in someone with the cunning of Athena. He knew that, without help, the boy would have no possibility against Medusa. But with his guide, Perseus could become a hero, and, most importantly, in the middle to end a symbol of humiliation that had long tormented her. Athena got off his throne, wrapped in his imposing divine aura, and looked for Hermes, the fast messenger of the gods. Hermes was cunning, practical, and always willing to intervene in mortal affairs if the intrigue was entertaining. When Athena explained his plan, he smiled with that mischievous spark in the eyes that characterized him so much. Together, they traced a path for Perseus, a path full of obstacles, but also of carefully placed tools to take it to their destination. The first part of the plan was to equip it. He could not face Medusa with simple mortal weapons. Athena offered her shield, one forged in pure bronze, so polished that she could reflect the world as a perfect mirror. He explained, with the firmness and authority of those who do not accept errors, that this shield would be his only protection against the gang's gaze. Never look directly into his eyes, he warned him. If you do, there will be no power in this world that can save you. Hermes, on the other hand, gave him the winged sandals, a gift that would allow Perseus to move with an unattainable speed for any mortal or immortal creature. He explained that flying would not only help him reach the island of Gorgon, but also to dodge the attacks of Medusa and his sisters, Istino and Euryale. The sandals were light as the air, but their magic was powerful, a reminder that, although the gods played with mortals, they were also given advantages when they suited them. But Athena knew this would not be enough. To get to Medusa, Perseus needed something else, information. The location of Gorgon Island was a mystery, known only for a few creatures worldwide. The Grace, sisters of the Gorgons, were the key. These three old women shared a single eye and a single tooth, and their knowledge of the whereabouts of Medusa was invaluable. However, they were not known for their generosity. Athena knew that Perseus would have to be more cunning than them to get what she needed. Before leaving, Athena and Hermes gave him another tool, a magical bag called Chimera, designed to contain Medusa's head once he was cut. It is not any head, Athena explained, his voice full of serious. Even after death, his gaze retains the power to turn men into stone. Use this bag to protect others. Perseus nodded, understanding that the task in front of him was much more than a simple act of courage. Each step was loaded with danger, but also of a greater purpose than himself. However, Athena's plan was not limited to equipping Perseus. There was something deeper behind his speech, something that Perseus, in his naivety, could not see. Athena not only wanted Medusa to be defeated, I wanted Medusa's story to end once and for all. La Gorgona was a constant reminder of a transgression that had occurred in her temple, a reminder of her own anger and the humiliation she had felt when she was challenged by Poseidon. Perseus was his way of cleaning that stain, of demonstrating that even the errors of the gods could be corrected. While Perseus prepared to leave, Athena looked at him with a mixture of pride and coldness. He knew that the young man had the courage and strength necessary to complete his mission, but he also knew he was being manipulated. For Athena, that didn't matter. Mortals had always been tools in the gods of the gods, and Perseus was no exception. He saw it as a key piece in his strategy, a means to achieve an end much larger than himself. But even with all his power and wisdom, Athena could not foresee how the mission would affect Perseus. In his mind, he was a hero who would fulfill his task and return triumphantly. He did not think about the emotional weight he would carry, the questions that would arise in his mind when he finally faced Medusa. Because, although Athena had equipped it with everything necessary to kill, she had not given her the tools to understand the tragedy of life that was about to snatch. Perseus left, full of determination and trust, without realizing that he was caught in a much larger game than he imagined. And Athena, from the Olympus, observed every movement, sure that his plan was underway, sure that his goal was about to be fulfilled. But even for the gods, destiny is unpredictable, and the decisions they make always have consequences that they cannot even control completely. The Perseus journey began with an air of uncertainty and a weight in the chest that had never felt before. The tools that the gods had been granted, the brilliant shield of Athena, the winged sandals of Hermes and the magic bag, were irrefutable evidence that fate had chosen it for something monumental. But it was not the magical objects that worried him, but the magnitude of the task. Defeating Medusa was not only a physical challenge, but an act that would put him in front of a monster whose existence itself was a tragedy. The first obstacle on their way were the Grace, those elders of withered appearance, whose only eye shone like a curse in the gloom. Finding them was not easy. The Grace lived in a dark corner of the world, where sunlight barely reached and air seemed to be impregnated with forgotten secrets. Perseus came to them with a mixture of nervousness and determination, knowing that what I was looking for would not be voluntarily given. The three old women, wrapped in grey clothes that seemed to be an extension of their bodies, received it with disdain. They shared a single eye and a single tooth, passing them from one to another with clumsy and mechanical movements, while muttering incomprehensible words. Perseus, cunning as he had learned from his mother Danae, waited for the right moment. When one of them raised his eye to pass it to the next, he snatched it quickly, leaving the Grace in a state of confusion and despair. "Return our eye to us," they implored with worn voices, but full of poison. Perseo held the eye in his hand, observing the strange brightness he emitted. "First tell me where to find Medusa," he replied, firm but without arrogance. I knew I couldn't trust them, but I also understood that, at that time, I had the advantage. The Grace protested, growled and tried to intimidate him, but finally yielded. With words full of resentment, they revealed the location of the island of Gorgon, a place isolated by raging seas and protected by almost impenetrable darkness. With the information he needed, Perseo launched the eye to the ground and moved away before the Grace could try to take revenge. His next destiny was the land of the nymphs, benevolent but elusive beings, who had a last gift for him, the Hosda Adamantina, a weapon capable of crossing the skin of Medusa, as hard as the rock itself. The nymphs, although less hostile than the Grace, did not offer the sickle without before trying. They asked him to tell them his purpose, and hearing about their mission, they saw in their eyes a mixture of honesty and courage that seemed enough to them. When Perseo finally left for the island of Gorgon, the true journey began. The winged sandals took him through vast and unknown skies, where the stars seemed closer than the earth. But even at the heights, the danger stalking it. The winds were capricious, and more than once it was about to be dragged towards the void. There were times when I doubted, in which the cold of the height and the weight of the mission made him wonder if any mortal had been really designed to face a creature as a jellyfish. Gorgon Island was a place that did not belong to the world of men or that of the gods. From a distance, Perseus could see how the fog covered its coast, as if the place itself tried to hide from those who dared to look for it. The roar of the waves hitting the rocks echoed as a warning, but Perseus had no choice but to advance. Time seemed to stop while descending, winged sandals slowly taking him to the ground, where he knew something expected that no human had faced and lived to tell. The way to the heart of the island was not empty. Deformed and monstrous creatures wandered around, guardians of a place where death was the only certainty. Perseus, armed with your ingenuity and tools of the gods, he avoided direct confrontations whenever he could. He used the reflection of his shield to observe what he had in front of him, without daring to lower his guard. Each shadow, every crunch of the leaves under his feet, was a threat that could mean the end of his mission and of his life. In the solitude of the island, his mind did not stop running. He thought of Medusa, the stories he had heard about her, in what the gods had told her. It was a dangerous creature, yes, but also a victim. Perseus could not ignore the contradiction. He was hunting to a being who had been cursed and exiled for the same deities that now used him as his tool. As he approached the place where Medusa expected, that restlessness began to grow in his chest, although he could not afford to stop. Finally, he came to the place where the air seemed to become heavier, loaded with a disturbing silence. The smell of cold stone and death filled the atmosphere. Poseidon knew he was close. The statues of petrified warriors decorated the landscape, reminders of those who had arrived before him and had failed. Each figure was a monument to fear and courage, a warning and a challenge. While walking cautiously, with the high shield and the hose in the other hand, the world seemed to close ranks around him. The presence of Medusa was palpable, even before seeing her. His heart was beating strongly, not only for fear, but for the enormity of what he was about to do. Medusa was not just a monster. It was a symbol, a victim, and soon, perhaps, one more piece on the board of the gods. The shield shone under the dim light, reflecting distorted images of the environment. It was not a common shield, its polished surface as a mirror had a purpose beyond defense. Athena had given him to Perseus with a clear warning: never look at Medusa directly. Use this to face her without succumbing to her gaze. That unique instruction weighed in Perseus's mind while holding it, understanding that this object was not only a weapon, but its only hope to survive the confrontation with the Gorgon. The shield was not simply a piece of forged bronze. He had been worked with a divine perfection, molded by the hands of Hephaestus, the blacksmith god. Every detail talked about its purpose, a weapon both to protect and reflect, to turn the danger of looking at Medusa into an advantage. Perseus noticed how he could see his own face on the surface, clear and clear, as if he were observed through a crystalline pond. But behind that image, he also perceived a symbol of Athena, a owl recorded at the top of the shield, a constant warning that wisdom should guide his actions. Hermes's winged sandals, on the other hand, represented movement and speed, the lightness of a god who dominated the impossible paths. When Perseus placed them for the first time, he felt as if his body separated from the ground, as if the world lost its weight. Sandals were not simple accessories, they were the promise of freedom, to escape the inevitable. They will take you where no man can arrive, Hermes had said, his casual tone but loaded with meaning. The wings, small but full of life, seemed to move on their own, restless, as if waiting for the time to launch into the void and cross the skies. Perseus quickly understood that the sandals were not just a means to reach the island of Gorgon. They were also a tool to avoid danger, to move faster than death itself. While using them, he felt almost invincible, as if he were above human limitations. But I also understood that it was not enough to be fast. I needed to be precise, know when to move forward and when to go back. The sandals could take it anywhere, but they could not protect it from their own mistakes. And then there was the sword, a weapon that had no comparison in the deadly world. The mortals called her a sickle, but her real name was unknown to them, as if the simple act of pronouncing it was a sacrilege. Forged in adamantina, a material so rare that only the gods could mold it, the sword was light and at the same time unbreakable. His edge was so sharp that he could even go through the hardest scales, the same ones that covered Medusa's body as a second skin. Hephaestus, with his divine mastery, had created the sword not only to cut, but to defeat the impossible. Athena had placed the sword in Perseus's hands with a severe look. "Do not hesitate when the time comes," he said. "This edge will not only cut meat, cut the fate that we have entrusted to you." It was a reminder that this mission was not just his. It was an act that would resonate in the domains of the gods and men, an action that would alter the course of history. Poseidon felt the weight of the sword not only in his hand, but also in his soul. I knew that this weapon was destined to change it, to mark it in a way that I couldn't even imagine. Each tool had a specific purpose, and together they formed a set that seemed invincible. But Perseus knew that even with these divine gifts, the danger remained real. The shield could reflect Medusa's gaze, but he didn't stop it. The sandals could take it faster than the wind, but they could not prevent their steps from taking him to danger. The sword could cross anything, but the act of using it required more than physical strength, it required determination, a heart willing to face not only Medusa, but also the judgment of the gods. As Perseus advanced in his mission, the tools became more than objects. They were extensions of the gods themselves, manifestations of their will and their power. But they were also a reminder of their dependence. Perseus, although brave, was nothing without those gifts. He was a hero, yes, but one who walked with the weight of knowing that each of his movements was being observed, judged. The tools not only helped him, they also monitored it, as if Athena and Hermes were present at each step, in each decision. And so, while holding the shield, he felt the impulse of the sandals and wielded the sword. Perseus could not avoid wondering if these tools were a gift or a trap. Were they really designed to help him fulfill his mission, or were they part of a bigger game, a game that could never fully understand? I had no answers, but either time to look for them. The only thing he knew was that these divine tools approached him more to the final confrontation, to that moment when he would have to look, not with his eyes, but with his reflection, to the horror of Medusa and decide if he was worthy of being called a hero. The air was loaded with tension when Perseus reached the heart of the island of Gorgon. The landscape was a maze of rocks and shadows, illuminated only by a pale moon that seemed to observe from afar, almost with compassion. There was a strange silence, as if everyone contained breath. But Perseus knew I wasn't alone. He felt invisible eyes following him, like predators who lurk to his prey, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. His steps were careful, his look always fixed in the reflection of his shield. The land became increasingly hostile, covered with statues of petrified warriors, frozen in eternal horror positions. They were not just warnings, they were monuments to the power of the sisters who lived there. Each statue told frustrated courage, of ambitions crushed under the weight of an inescapable destination. Perseus tried not to look too much, but he couldn't help asking himself if he would soon be one more among them. Then, a sound broke the silence. It was a low seesaw, almost like a whisper dragged by the wind, but with a dark intention. Perseus stopped his steps, tightening more strongly the handle of the sword. Seesaw grew, transforming into a bitter and mocking laugh that resonated in the air. Before I could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, fast and lethal like a nightly fierce. It was a Steno. Steno, the eldest of the sisters, had a presence that froze the blood. His eyes, although they did not have the petrifying power of Medusa, seemed able to cross the will of any man. His body was a mixture of the human and the monstrous, with scales that reflected the moonlight as a mantle of live metal. His voice was serious, full of contempt. "Another mortal who comes to play the hero," he said, slowly moving towards Perseus. "It is always the same. First, then desperate, and finally, stone." Before I could answer, a second Seesaw joined the first. From another dark corner, Euryale appeared. The younger sister, although less imposing than Steno, was no less dangerous. His walk was more agile, almost feline, and his gaze was loaded with a contained fury that seemed ready to explode. Euryale didn't talk much, his heavy breathing and rapid movements were enough to convey their intention. They surrounded Perseus as wolves, moving with a coordination that only sisters could share. Perseus knew that he couldn't face them head-on. It was not only their physical strength that made them formidable, but the synchrony they attacked. Each movement of one complemented that of the other, creating a mortal dance that had ended with many before him. With the shield raised, he observed his reflexes on the brilliant surface, looking for a pattern, a weakness, something that could give him a chance. But the sisters were fast, and their strategy was not just attacking, they played with him, testing their limits, wearing their resistance. "Why are you going on?" Steno asked as he launched an attack that Perseus barely managed to dodge. "What makes you think that you can against us?" "Against Medusa?" His tone was not of real curiosity, but of mockery, as if he knew that words could be as lethal as their claws. Perseus did not respond. He knew that any distraction could be fatal. The fight was intense. Steno and Euryale attacked from different angles, forcing him to move constantly, to calculate each step with precision. Winged sandals gave him a crucial advantage, allowing him to evade attacks that would have been impossible to avoid for any other. But even with that advantage, Perseus began to feel fatigue. His muscles burned, his breathing was fast and superficial, and the mental pressure of staying alert was wearing it. Euryale released a cry of frustration when one of her attacks failed, hitting the ground with a force that made the rocks tremble. "It's just a human!" he exclaimed, his fury now evident. But Perseus was not a common human, and they knew it. Despite their teasing, both sisters could feel that this man was different. There was something in his gaze, in his position, which told them that he would not give up so easily. Finally, Perseus found his chance. Steno and Euryale, confident in their superiority, made a small mistake. They left a space, an instant in which their perfect coordination broke. Perseus saw him reflected in his shield and acted without hesitation. With a rapid movement, he used the sandals to rise above them, escaping from his fence. From that position, he launched an attack with the sword, pointing not to them, but to one of the nearby rocks. The impact created a cloud of dust that disoriented them, giving him enough time to run into the cave where he knew that Medusa was waiting for him. Steno and Euryale launched screams of fury that resonated as dark echoes on the island. They would not follow. They knew that their younger sister was at the end of that path, and that Medusa did not need her help to end him. But while Perseus advanced, he felt that the confrontation with the sisters had been more than a simple fight. He had seen something in his eyes, in the rage and pain they shared, which made him doubt for a moment. These were not simple monsters. They were sisters, guardians of a being who had been unjustly convicted. Perseus shook those thoughts of his mind. He couldn't afford to doubt. Not now. Not when the real challenge was just a few steps. The air inside the cave was dense, almost suffocating. Each Perseus step resonated on the walls like an endless echo, announcing his arrival at something bigger than himself. I knew there was no turning back. The statues scattered by the entrance were just a prelude to what awaited him. There were no petrified warriors with expressions of fear. The figures were crooked in an absolute horror, a silent testimony of inhuman power that inhabited the depths. And then, silence. A silence that was not natural, as if even time had stopped in this world's forgotten corner. Perseus breathed deep, adjusted the shield on his left arm and tightly squeezed the handle of the sword. He couldn't trust his eyes, everything depended on the reflection in the shield, a mirror that would be his salvation or his downfall. A slight movement made him stop. There she was. Jellyfish. He did not look directly, but his reflection on the shield was enough to fill his chest with a cold terror. The Gorgona was standing, motionless for a moment, as if he knew that an intruder had dared to enter her refuge. The snakes that formed their hair were with restlessness, moving as if they were alive, as extensions of their anger. His body was imposing, covered with scales that seemed to shine with a sinister glow under the faint light that leaked from the roof cracks. Medusa spoke, and his voice was not what Perseus expected. He was not a monstrous roar or a furious scream. It was a murmur loaded with tiredness, of a sadness that cut deeper than any weapon. "Another one?" he said, his almost indifferent tone. "How many have come before you? How many have become stone, believing they were heroes?" Perseus did not respond. I knew there was no place for the words here, only for action. But in his silence, he felt something strange. It wasn't just fear, it was empathy. There was something in the voice of Medusa that made him doubt, although only for an instant. The first attack was fast, almost too fast. One of the snakes in the head of Medusa threw himself towards him like a ray, his fangs shining with poison. Perseus barely managed to dodge it, using winged sandals to move with a speed that saved his life. The sound of the whistle resonated in his ears as he turned on himself, keeping the high shield, always attentive to the reflection. Medusa moved with an agility that did not seem possible for someone trapped in such an imposing body. Each movement of his was a challenge, a proof of patience and Perseus' reflexes. The fight was not just physical, it was psychological. Medusa did not stop talking, his voice now full of bitterness. "What do you think you will achieve by killing me? Glory? Redemption? Or are you just fulfilling the orders of gods that do not care?" His words were like knives, aimed at the depths of Perseus's mind. They tried to sow doubts, break their determination. But Perseus could not afford to hesitate. Every second that passed, it was an opportunity for Medusa to end him. The reflexes in the shield were confused, a chaos of rapid movements, snakes that curled and attacked, claws looking for a weak point. But Perseus had been trained for this. He knew he could not rush, that he should wait for the exact moment. The confrontation reached a critical point when Medusa, frustrated by not being able to reach it, threw a roar that made the cave tremble. The snakes stirred furious, hitting the air like poisonous whips. With a fast movement, Medusa hit the ground with its tail, causing the rocks to detach from the roof and fall in waterfall. Perseus barely managed to dodge one of them, feeling how dust and stone fragments surrounded him. His heart was beating hard, but his hands remained firm. I knew the moment was close. And then he saw it. In the reflection, for the first time, he perceived an opening. Medusa had slightly lowered the guard, tired of the intensity of the fight. It was a fleeting moment, a blink of chaos, but for a warrior like Perseus, that was enough. With a cry that resonated throughout the cave, Perseus threw himself forward. The sandals promoted him with an impossible speed, while the shield continued to guide him. Medusa reacted, turning her head in her direction, but Perseus did not look at her. With a precise movement, he raised the sword and drew a perfect arch into his neck. The adamantino edge cut the air, and then, the silence. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Perseus did not feel the impact, but when he opened his eyes and saw the reflection on the shield, he knew he had ended. Medusa was motionless, his head separated from his body, falling to the ground with a deaf sound. The snakes continued to stir, as if they did not understand what had happened, but little by little they were still staying. Perseus breathed with difficulty, letting reality reach him. He had defeated. He had done what no one had been able to do. But while looking at Medusa's inert body, he didn't feel the victory he had expected. There was something in that scene, in the expression of his petrified face, which filled him with an inexplicable sadness. He had won, yes, but at a cost that he could not fully understand. However, there was no time to reflect. He knew that he had to collect the head of Medusa, which would be his trophy and his salvation in the future. While he was careful in the magic bag that Athena had given her, Perseus felt a strange connection with her. It wasn't just a monster, he had been a victim, someone who had suffered an injustice that he couldn't even correct. The cave remained silent while Perseus moved away, carrying not only Medusa's head, but also the weight of what he had done. Outside, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to the confrontation that had just taken place. But in some corner of Olympus, the gods were surely observing, satisfied that their plan had been executed. Perseus's sword had cut the air with deadly precision, a fast and accurate movement that sealed the fate of Medusa. The sound of steel tearing flesh and the throat of his head when they fell to the ground resonated in the cave, a final echo that marked the end of a tragic existence. For a moment, everything was silent. The snakes in the head of Medusa continued to stir, twisted in an ultimate spasm, as if they resisted accepting the reality of their defeat. The inert body of Medusa was there, motionless, with a posture that, paradoxically, evoked a kind of peace that he had never had in life. But the end was not so simple. The death of Medusa not only brought the conclusion of his torment, it also gave rise to something completely unexpected. Perseus, still trembling with the intensity of the fight, could not foresee what was about to happen. Suddenly, the cave began to vibrate. It was a subtle movement at the beginning, as if the ground were waking up from a long dream, but soon vibrations grew in intensity. Perseus took a step back, with the sword still in his hand, looking around with caution. Then he saw it. The creature was beautiful, a living contradiction to the horror he had just witnessed. But I wasn't alone. While Pegasus finished forming, another being began to emerge from blood. This was different, more solid, more human in its form. It was Chrysaor, a warrior of imposing proportions, with a skin that seemed golden brown, as if it had been directly forged by the gods. Chrysaor did not speak, but his presence was enough to fill the cave with a feeling of power and solemnity. He was the son of Medusa, born of his death, a paradox that resonated in Perseus's mind. The birth of these two creatures was fast, but the impact they left was deep. Pegaso, with an elegant movement, approached Perseus, slightly tilting his head as if he recognized it. Chrysaor, on the other hand, remained a certain distance, observing the warrior with an inscrutable expression. It was as if they both understood that, although they were born from the tragedy, they were not part of the anger or the hatred that had marked Medusa's life. Perseus, still stunned, I didn't know what to do. He had come to this island with a clear mission, to defeat Medusa and take his head as a trophy. But what was witnessing went beyond what I had imagined. I could not ignore the irony of the situation. The death of Medusa, seen by many as a victory, was also a birth, a creation that transcended the violence that had originated it. The ground stopped vibrating, and the cave plunged into silence again. Pegasus extended its wings once again, dropping a few drops of blood that sparkled when touching the ground. Then, with a powerful jump, he flew towards the entrance of the cave, disappearing on the starry night. Chrysaor followed him with his gaze, but did not make a threat to follow him. Instead, he walked towards the exit with a calm that seemed almost solemn, leaving Perseus only with his thoughts. The hero stayed there for a moment, unable to move. Medusa's head was still on the ground, his hidden gaze, but still loaded with a power that had not completely extinguished. Perseus finally picked up his head, carefully keeping it in the magical bag he carried, but his mind was far from the glory that was supposed to feel. Instead of triumph, there was a sense of weight, an understanding that Medusa's death was not the end of the story. He had left something behind, something he would live far beyond his tragedy. While leaving the cave, Perseus could not help looking to the sky. In the distance, he could see a shadow flying, probably Pegaso, moving freely among the stars. It was a reminder that even in the darkest acts, life had a way of rebirth, of transforming pain into something else. But it was also a reminder that the gods, with all their powers, continued playing with the destinies of mortals, leaving a trace of questions without answers and legacies that no one had asked. The weight of the bag on Perseus was much more than that of Medusa's head. It was a symbolic weight, a load that contained both power and tragedy. The Gorgon was dead, but her petrifying gaze was still alive, encapsulated in that macabre trophy. Perseus had achieved what seemed impossible, but I still did not completely understand what he carried. While returning along the same dangerous path that had taken him to Gorgona, he began to discover the true nature of Medusa's legacy. The first confrontation occurred abruptly. A group of bandits, mercenaries without honor, intercepted it in a narrow step between the mountains. Perseus barely had time to draw his sword before they surrounded him, his faces hardened by greed and cruelty. "Ask us what you carry," demanded the leader, a corpulent man with a scar that crossed his face. "You won't get out of here if you don't." Perseus, tired but determined, looked around, calculating his possibilities. They were too many to face them with brute force, and could not risk losing Medusa's head. But then he remembered. The bag he wore was not just a dead weight, it was a weapon, a power that could change the course of any battle. With a mixture of caution and determination, he slowly lowered the bag and opened it, revealing the head of Medusa. The effect was immediate. The faint light of the sun that is Philae looked between the mountains illuminated the empty but still alive eyes of Medusa. The bandits, who at first make fun, were paralyzed by understanding what they were seeing. One after another, their bodies began to harden, their expressions of surprise and horror being recorded forever in stone. The leader tried to look away, but it was too late. His cry was caught in his throat while his flesh was transformed into marble, his body falling heavily to the ground, now an inert statue. The silence that followed was deafening. Perseus breathed deeply, closing the bag carefully before looking around. The statues were a brutal reminder of power that now carried with them. He didn't feel victorious, instead, a chill toured his back. He had used Medusa's head, but in that act, he had felt a shadow of the injustice she had endured. His power was terrifying, definitive, and left no room for second opportunities. The use of Medusa's head did not end there. As Perseus continued his trip, the trophy became his most valuable resource, but also a constant reminder of the sacrifice that had originated him. In each confrontation, in each obstacle, Medusa's head was the final solution. When a group of warriors sent by an enemy king tried to ambush him, Perseus faced them with the same result, a collection of stone figures that joined the legend that grew around him. However, not all who witnessed the power of the head were turned into stone. Some managed to escape, carrying stories of a hero who faced the gaze of death itself. The word spread rapidly, and soon Perseus ceased to be seen as a simple warrior. It became an almost divine, feared, and revered figure in the same extent. But that fame did not come without its price. Perseus began to notice something strange. With every use of Medusa's head, he felt that a part of himself changed. It was not a physical change, but something deeper, more intangible. It was as if Medusa's power was leaving a mark on his spirit, constantly reminding him that this was not a human power, but one that belonged to the domain of the gods. And the gods never gave power without asking for anything in return. The most shocking moment occurred when Perseus finally reached the kingdom of Polydectes, the tyrant who had sent him in this impossible mission. Polydectes, arrogant and safe from his authority, received it with disdain, mocking his supposed triumph. "Where is your trophy, young Perseus?" he asked with a mocking smile, surrounded by his courtiers. Without pronouncing a word, Perseus drew Medusa's head once again. The mockery on the face of Polydectes faded in an instant, replaced by a mixture of terror and surprise. His body became stone before everyone's eyes, his frozen expression in a grimace of disbelief. The courtiers shouted and fled, leaving the hero alone in the throne room, surrounded by the sepulchral silence of the statues. Perseus closed the bag carefully, feeling a mixture of relief and unease. He had fulfilled his mission, he had defeated a tyrant, but he could not ignore the feeling that every use of Medusa's head away a little more from himself. The head was not only a weapon, it was a load, a constant connection with a tragedy that could not undo. While leaving the palace, Perseus looked at the horizon, knowing that his trip had not yet ended. Medusa's head would continue to be his partner, his salvation in moments of danger, but also his darkest reminder. He had inherited the power of a victim, and with that power came the responsibility of using it cautiously, knowing that every look that petrified his enemies carried with him an echo of the curse of Medusa. The cry of Istino broke the silence of the island when he knew the destiny of his sister. A guttural roar, full of pain, which resonated throughout Gorgon, crossing the heavy air of that cursed place. Euryale, the most sensitive of the three, dropped his body on the cold stone that once was the refuge of Medusa. The tears did not sprout from their eyes, because the Gorgons, damned as they were, did not know the relief of crying. But the pain in his chest was as real as the steel that his sister's life had taken away. He was a human, Sisio, his voice loaded with fury. An insignificant mortal who had the rudeness to lift his sword against our blood. Euryale did not respond. His red eyes, brilliant as burning coals, stuck in the place where Medusa had fallen, in a vacuum that now seemed to fill everything. There was nothing left, except the echo of his absence. Rabies and pain were intertwined in both sisters, forming a hate bond that would never break. "Not just a human," added Euryale finally, his broken voice. "The gods are behind this. Athena, always Athena, with their damn arrogance and cruel games. And Poseidon, whose ambition destroyed our sister from the beginning." Steno squeezed his teeth, his claws tearing the rock as if it were butter. The impotence boiled within it, a force that did not find a clear goal. "It doesn't matter who is responsible. I swear they will pay. All of them. Human, gods, who crosses our way." But reality was another. Despite their fury, the sisters knew that facing the gods was not possible. They themselves were the product of their whim, creatures condemned to a life of isolation, monsters in the eyes of the world. Athena, with his unquestionable power, and Poseidon, the lord of the vast sea, were out of reach. They knew it, but that did not relieve the odor of revenge that burned in its guts. For days, the sisters wandered on the island, unable to find peace. The cave where Medusa had lived and finally found death became a sanctuary and a prison. Steno hit the walls, shouting at a sky that did not respond, while boiling, quieter, plunged into dark thoughts. Both sought a way of doing justice, of returning the blow to those who had destroyed their world. Rumors quickly arrived at the island. A lost traveler, desperate to escape the dangers of nearby waters, spoke of the hero who had defeated Medusa and now carried his head as a trophy. Perseus, they called him, a young man favored by the gods, armed with divine tools and protected by his own destiny. Upon listening to their name, the Gorgons felt how their hatred focused on a single direction. They could not touch Athena or Poseidon, but this Perseus. He was human. And humans could die. "We will find it," said Steno, his voice echoing with the strength of an unwavering promise. Euryale nodded silently, his eyes full of a gloomy resolution. The sisters prepared to leave the island, a place that had been their home and their prison for centuries. They did not know how they would cross the vast sea, but the fury gave them strength, and the desire for revenge was a lighthouse that guided them. However, fate is not kind to monsters. As much as they tried, Steno and Euryale found invisible barriers. The island kept them trapped, a prison created by the gods to ensure that their power could not extend beyond. The frustration of the sisters grew with each failed attempt to escape, with every day that passed while Perseus was still alive, enjoying their victory. Steno, unable to accept defeat, began to vent his anger in any creature that dared to approach the island. The ships that sailed too close became ruins, their crews transformed into statues by the power that the sisters shared with their late sister. The sailors began talking about Gorgon as a cursed place, a territory that no sensible man had to cross. Euryale, on the other hand, sank into an increasingly deep silence, her hatred transforming into a weight that consumed her slowly. "There is no justice," he finally said one night, while both sat next to the entrance of the cave. "There were never. The gods play with us as if we were pieces on their board. What are we against them? Nothing but their broken toys." Steno did not respond immediately. He looked at the horizon, where the sea and heaven joined in the dark. "We may not face the gods," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. "But I will not give up. Not as long as someone who bears our sister's name is in vain. Not as long as Perseo breathes." The promise of revenge was still alive, even if it seemed impossible. Although they could not leave the island, the sisters found ways to keep the memory of Medusa alive. Each statue that added to the coast of Gorgon was a reminder of their power, a tribute to the sister they had lost. And although Perseo's name echoed as a hero in the deadly world, for Steno and Euryale was the symbol of everything they had taken away. The hatred of the sisters became their strength, a fire that never went out. And although they knew that they could never directly challenge the gods, their revenge took a more subtle and lasting form: fear. The island of Gorgon, with its coasts full of statues and its air full of threat, became a warning for anyone who dared to approach. In their isolation, Steno and Euryale became living legends, guardians of the memory of Medusa, carriers of an eternal hatred that even the gods could not erase completely. The blood that sprouted from Medusa's neck was not just a river of life that went out. It was something else, something that carried the secretos of his lineage and the contained force of his curse. When Perseus's sword fell and separated the head of Medusa from his body, the earth trembled. From that spilled blood, something unexpected arose, something that would fill even the gods themselves. Of the crimson drops, from that brutal act, Pegaso, the winged horse, was born a creature that would change the course of many stories in Greek mythology. Pegasus's birth was not a silent event. His appearance was marked by a flash of light, as if the universe was rasped for a moment to give way to the extraordinary. His white body, like snow, glowing even under the cloudy sky of that island, rose between the blood and flesh that had once been a jellyfish. With a powerful beat of its wings, the air was filled with dust and leaves, as if nature itself recognized it as something sacred, something outside this world. But Pegasus was not the only one born of that blood. Chrysaor appeared next to him, a guerrero giant with a golden sword. Although both shared the same origin, it was Pegasus who captured everyone's attention. His majesty, his innate grace, distinguished him as a unique creature, one that did not belong completely either to the world of mortals or that of the gods. From the moment his bright eyes opened to the world, Pegasus was not a simple beast, it was a symbol of freedom, power, and, paradoxically, esperanza. However, its connection with Medusa could not be ignored. Pegasus, although pure and radiant, carried in itself the weight of his mother's suffering. Each beating of its wings was a tragedy reminder that had led to its creation. The gods knew it, and although they admired their beauty and strength, they also saw it as an awkward reminder of their own excesses and cruelty. It was as if Pegasus were a bridge between two worlds, that of the brutality of the gods and the silent resistance of those who suffered under their yoke. Poseidon, Medusa's father, was also Pegasus's father. But the god of the sea did not claim his son as his own. Perhaps it was shame, perhaps the wounded pride, but Poseidon maintained his distance. Pegasus, on the other hand, did not need anyone. From the moment of his birth, he moved with an independence that defined him. With a jump, he raised flight, leaving behind the blood stained with blood that had been his crib. Heaven became his home, a kingdom that no god could control completely. Pegasus soon became a coveted creature. The heroes and kings dreamed of riding it, with tame the winged horse that seemed unattainable. But Pegasus was not something that could be possessed. It was free, a force of nature that responded only to his own will. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, was one of the few who managed to gain her trust. It was she who took him to Perseus, giving the hero an aid that would save him on more than one occasion. Despite their connection with the gods and the heroes, Pegasus was not a simple tool in their hands. In each of his actions, on each majestic flight, something deeper was perceived, something that seemed to come directly from Medusa. It was as if the spirit of the Gorgon lived in her son, not in the form of revenge, but as a force that refused to be forgotten. Pegasus, with his purity and power, was a perfect contradiction to the cruel destiny his mother had suffered. It was a reminder that, even in the tragedy, something beautiful could arise. The winged horse not only lived in the legends, he also participated in them. He was the faithful companion of Bellerophonte, the hero who managed to tame him with the help of a golden flange delivered by Athena. Together, they faced and defeated La Chimera, a monstrous creature that terrified mortals. Pegasus, with its speed and agility, became the most powerful weapon of Bellerophonte, taking it to heights that no other hero could reach. However, even in that relationship, Pegasus never ceased to be a symbol of freedom. Although it served Bellerophonte, he never completely submitted to him. The tragedy of Bellerophonte, who tried to fly to Olympus on the back of Pegasus and was shot down by Zeus, marked another point in the history of the winged creature. After that event, Pegasus returned to the heavens, where the gods finally accepted him as one of his. It was Zeus who welcomed him, giving him a place in the Olympus and a unique task: bring thunder and ray, the most powerful weapons of the king of the gods. Thus, Pegaso became more than a symbol of freedom, it became a bridge between the mortal and the divine world, a creature that belonged to both and none. Over the centuries, Pegasus continued to be an immortal figure in the stories that were told under the stars. His connection with Medusa, although often forgotten, remained the heart of his existence. Every time its wings furrowed the sky, he carried not only the weight of his own legend, but also the echo of a story of injustice, resistance, and transformation. Pegaso, the winged horse born from the blood of a Gorgon, was not simply one more hero in the Greek stories. It was a symbol that even in the most cruel act, even at the darkest moment, something could be born that challenged the gods, that it flew beyond their limits, and that he lived forever in the dreams of mortals. The return of Perseus to the lands of men was a show that ignited everyone's imagination. He rode triumphant, with Medusa's head in his bag, a feared and revered trophy in equal parts. Their steps were accompanied by the murmur of the curious, by improvised songs that celebrated their courage and the looks of admiration of the mortals who saw in him not only a man, but a symbol of what can be achieved with the blessing of the gods. However, in the midst of all that splendor, there was a painful silence, a deliberate oblivion, the tragedy of Medusa. The Gorgon was not remembered as the priestess that once was, nor as the woman who suffered the whim of the gods. In the words of the poets and in the stories told around the fires, Medusa was just a monster, a beast whose existence terrified the world. His face was not that of a victim, but that of a threat, his name, not a lament, but a notice of what could happen when the inhuman challenged the divine. Perseus, on the other hand, was the hero who had freed the world from that supposed abomination, the man who had faced the impossible and returned unharmed. When King Polydectes arrived at the court, the man who had sent him to the mission hoping to see him die, Perseus did not waste time in showing his trophy. With a single movement, he drew the head of Medusa and transformed the king into stone. It was an act that left everyone out of breath, a deployment of power that consolidated its place as a legendary hero. But in the process, the history of Medusa was even more buried under the weight of Perseus's heroic narrative. It didn't matter who she was or how she had become what she was, the only relevant was his death, and the man who had been brave enough to face her. The songs multiplied. The bards narrated the Perseus feat with words full of greatness, exaggerating the dangers he had faced, the terror he had overcome. The story became myth, and the myth, really absolute. Medusa was relegated to being a footnote in the glorious Perseus epic. No one talked about how she had been unjustly cursed, or how her monstrosity was the result of cruel punishment. Instead, the image of La Gorgona was repeated again and again as an incarnate evil, a creature that deserved its destiny. Perseus, meanwhile, seemed to accept without questions the role that had been granted. He was celebrated, full of gifts and honors. He was offered land, wealth, and even a wife, Andromeda, whom he had rescued from another monster during his trip. Each banquet, each ceremony, was a reaffirmation of its glory. Mortals venerated him, the gods watched him with interest. Athena, in particular, was pleased. He had guided his steps, had provided him with the necessary tools to succeed, and now he saw how his will was fulfilled. Medusa, the woman who had tainted her temple, was dead, and her story had been almost completely erased. But in the moments of silence, when the songs ceased and the crowds dispersed, Perseus could not help thinking about Medusa's gaze. Although he had avoided confronting his eyes directly, the few times that his reflection in the shield had caught his face, something inside him had shuddered. It was not just the horror what I had seen in it, there was also something human, something that persecuted him in the darkest corners of his mind. Was that the look of a monster, or that of someone who had been betrayed by the world who had to protect her? No one seemed to ask why Medusa had been as it was. No one questioned the narrative that had been woven around her. Perseus himself, perhaps for comfort, perhaps for fear, did not allow himself to be deepened in those doubts. After all, he was the hero, the man who had done what no one dared to try. His glory depended on the story of Medusa remained as it was, simple, clear, free of uncomfortable nuances. While the days became weeks and weeks in years, Medusa's head remained used as a weapon. Perseus carried her with him, showing her in times of necessity, turning into stone those who interposed on her way. But with each use, the head seemed to lose some of its vitality. The snakes that adorned their hair moved less, their eyes went out slowly. It was as if even in death, Medusa was being consumed, reduced to a simple instrument of power. The glory of Perseus continued to grow, while the truth of Medusa vanished. His history, his suffering, his humanity, everything was buried under the shadow of the hero who defeated him. But deep down, something remained. Every time someone talked about Medusa's petrifying gaze, his power even in death, a small spark of his memory was still alive. And although the world had forgotten her as a woman, as a victim, as a priestess, her legacy, however distorted she was, remained a reminder that the gods, in their cruelty, could not completely erase what they had tried to destroy. Perseus continued his life, surrounded by glory and admiration. But every time he looked at the shield where Medusa's head rested, he couldn't help feeling that something watched him from the inside, something he could not completely ignore, something that forced him to remember, even if it was only for a moment, that his glory he was born from the suffering of another. And although the world called him a hero, in the darkest corners of his conscience, Perseus could not avoid wondering if the true monstrosity did not live, after all, in himself and in those who had pushed him to be what he was. Poseidon watched the horizon from the depths of his submarine palace. The sea was calm, an infinite blue extension that reflected its unwavering power. The waves obeyed their will, the winds danced to the beat of their wishes, and the creatures of the ocean bowed to their presence. And yet, in his countenance, there was a disturbing stillness, an absence that no one could penetrate. The god of the sea remained silent, as if the shadows of what happened with Medusa did not deserve a thought, or a word, or a look. Since Athena transformed Medusa into a monster, Poseidon had opted for oblivion. There was no apology, no outrage, not even an attempt to justify their actions. The priestess who had been outraged in the temple was nothing more than a disposable piece in her eternal rivalry game with Athena. For him, what happened was not a tragedy, but a passing event, one of many in its divine existence. It was the privilege of the immortals. Time erased the traces of everything, except themselves. However, the sea knew it. The waves, which carried the secrets of each corner of the world, could not ignore the echo of that act. The depths whispered the history of Medusa, a story that the water creatures could not forget. The dolphins that crossed the waves often mentioned it in their songs, algae moved as if they remembered the melancholy that wrapped their name. But Poseidon, in his unfathomable majesty, remained indifferent, as if the weight of what happened had no place in his vast kingdom. The other gods had noticed their silence, but no one dared to mention it. Athena, with her pride still intact, did not look for answers or reconciliation. For her, the transformation of Medusa was a symbolic victory, an act that restored her stuffed honor. Zeus, meanwhile, never showed interest in intervening, his concern focused on maintaining the balance between the powers of Olympus. And mortals, as always, only remembered Poseidon as the lord of the sea, the god whose anger could sink entire cities. No one saw man behind the god. No one questioned his silence. But Poseidon's silence was not empty. It was an impenetrable layer that hid what perhaps not even he wanted to face. Had he felt something to see how Athena condemned Medusa? Had he noticed terror in the young woman's eyes while her body was transformed, while her humanity vanished forever? If he did, he hid well. There were no changes in his face, no sign of emotion that betrayed his thoughts. For him, the actions of the gods were inevitable, a dance of power and rivalry where mortals were nothing more than spectators trapped in crossfire. Sometimes, the waters brought involuntary memories to Poseidon. A shadow in the waves could resemble the jellyfish silhouette before his curse, when he was still a priestess of immense beauty and devotion. The sound of corals, when breaking against the rocks, could evoke the crunch of their voice, the stifled shouts in the temple of Athena. But he separated those thoughts as fast as they arrived. There was no space for weakness in the heart of a god. Compassion, after all, was a burden that only mortals carried. There was, however, a crack in the armor of his indifference. Although he never admitted it, Pegaso's birth was a sign that he could not ignore. The winged horse, born from the blood of Medusa, represented something more than a miracle of mythology. It was a living reminder that their actions had consequences, that even the cruelest acts could lead to something unexpected. Poseidon watched Pegasus from afar, with a mixture of pride and reluctance. It was his son, but he was also a testimony of the pain he had caused. Time continued its course, and Poseidon continued to rule the seas with the same relentless power. The mortals invoked him in his prayers, feared his anger and looked for his favor, but none dared to question his silence. The story of Medusa, on the other hand, continued to grow in the shadows. Rumors on their petrifying gaze spread, legends about their monstrosity multiplied. But in those stories, there was no mention of Poseidon, or his role in the origin of the tragedy. It was as if the god of the sea had erased his footprint from the narrative, as if his silence could acquit him from any responsibility. And so, the name of Medusa became synonymous with terror, while Poseidon remained associated with the majesty and strength of the ocean. No one talked about the connection between the two, how the story of one could not separate from that of the other. And Poseidon, faithful to his character, remained distant, as if the weight of what happened had never touched him. But the sea, an eternal witness of everything, knew the truth. The waves continued to whisper their name, as an endless echo that remembered that even the gods could not completely escape their actions. Poseidon's silence was not forgetting. It was a choice, a wall raised to protect from something that perhaps feared to face. But how long can that silence last before the waves knock him down? How much can a god of stories that are born from their own blood and their own pride hide? Maybe he didn't even know. Athena watched her shield with a calm that only a goddess as she could exhibit. There, in the center, there was the head of Medusa, beheaded, with fixed, petrified eyes, his frozen gaze forever in an expression that evoked both horror and desolation. Every time Athena, we looked at that image, a shadow crossed her face, a mixture of satisfaction and something else, something that she could not or did not want to name. It was the trophy of his victory, but also the reminder of an action that transcended beyond the punishment. The head of Medusa, now his, was a symbol of his absolute power, the demonstration that not even the gods could challenge her without consequences. When Athena raised her shield, Medusa's head became more than a simple part of her armament. He became the echo of his fury, the expression of his revenge. The snakes that formed the Gorgon hair moved, as if time could not calm the anger contained in their body. Athena not only used her to dazzle her enemies in the battle, but to reaffirm her superiority about those who had dared to challenge her. Medusa, the woman who had dared to get in her way, now was her weapon, her memory, her power banner. The goddess did not feel sorry for Medusa. There was no space for compassion in his heart, or for repentance. For her, the priestess who once consecrated her cult had been a victim of her own wishes, a woman who, for a moment, had diverted her devotion to another god. Medusa had ultimately only one piece on the board of a much larger game, a necessary sacrifice in its eternal struggle to maintain its purity and dominance. What had happened in the temple of Athena, what Poseidon had done to him, was nothing more than a piece of a gear that could not stop. And the punishment that Medusa had received was the only way to restore order. But while Athena looked at Medusa's head, something inside her shuddered. It was not remorse, much less. It was a more complex feeling, which settled in the depths of its being. Medusa, no matter how monster he had become, had been a woman, and his suffering could not be completely ignored. How many more gods had punished in the same way? How many others had been carried away by their wishes, only to be devoured by the same system that had created them? But those questions had no place in Athena's mind. If she began to question her own justice, she would lose everything she had achieved. The gods could not afford. They should be firm, unwavering, impartial. And Athena was Esso's epitome. The use of Medusa's head in his shield was, therefore, an act that transcended the physical war. It was a political statement, a manifestation of power and control. Athena, by exhibiting Medusa's head, not only dominated her enemies on the battlefield, but also sent a clear message: no one could challenge her unpunished. No one could dare to question their authority without suffering the most terrible consequences. Medusa had been a warning, and now his image was the lesson. The mortals, when they saw Athena's shield, were paralyzed. The warriors feared that a single glance at the head of Medusa could drag them to the sentence, petrified by their gaze. Nobody dared to challenge the will of the goddess, because the power of the petrifying gaze was only a manifestation of the divine force that resided in it. And the more they feared at the head of Medusa, the more they venerated Athena. She was the personified wisdom, justice, and strategy. His domain was absolute. However, there was something in Medusa's eyes, even in his death, which could not be completely destroyed. Athena knew it. When someone stared at the Gorgon's head, he could see beyond the monster, beyond the monstrosity of his body turned into stone. I could see, for a brief second, the young woman who had been. The one who had sworn devotion, the priestess who had fallen out of favor. Medusa's petrified look contained more than the anger of a god. There was a despair, a betrayal, an injustice that no snake in his head could erase. But Athena did not allow those thoughts to take shape in her mind. I couldn't afford it. In Olympus, weakness was the first step towards defeat. To be the goddess that everyone venerated and feared, had to stay distant from any emotion that could make her hesitate. His glory, his power, depended on their ability to move forward without looking back. The suffering of Medusa, the price that the young woman had paid for the betrayal of the gods, was irrelevant in the great scheme of divine justice. Athena's shield shone under the sun, reflecting the light with the same intensity with which she dominated the Olympus. Medusa's head, transformed into a symbol of Victoria, was the reminder that the gods, although powerful, were never exempt from their own laws. But that was a reminder that solo Athena could understand, because in his silence, in his justice, he resided by a power beyond mortal understanding. And so, Medusa's head continued to be the greatest representation of Athena's force, an image that terrified her enemies and glorified the goddess. But in the darkest corners of Olympus, where even the gods could not arrive, the image of Medusa continued to persist, as a distant echo that never stopped resonating in Athena's soul. The story of Medusa did not end his death. No, his legacy lasted long after Perseus cut his head and the echo of his cry faded in the wind. Her figure, the Gorgon, became a powerful symbol in Greek culture, a reminder of the complexes between the gods and mortals, between divine punishment and human tragedy. The influence of Medusa was like a shadow that did not vanish, but extended over time, penetrating Greek culture, beliefs, and art. As the generations passed, the history of Medusa was transformed. At first, his image evoked terror. The figure of the woman who, due to her beauty, had been the victim of a brutal injustice, became a symbol of what was happening when the gods were played with human destinations. Medusa's petrifying gaze was a reminder of human fragility, but also of the cruelty that the gods could exercise, even on their most devoted followers. Medusa was represented in the temples, in the shields of the heroes, and in the coins. In many cultures, his face was an amulet, a protection against evil, as if his own monstrosity had the power to scare away the dark. The Greeks, apparently, saw an ambiguous figure in it. Sometimes they feared it, sometimes they venerated it. The power of his gaze became a symbol of the eternal struggle between fate and free will, between what men could control and what was beyond their understanding. The artists of ancient Greece soon captured the essence of Medusa in their works. They sculpted their face in marble and stone, in such beautiful and terrifying shapes. The vision of Medusa, with his snake hair and his fierce expression, became one of the most powerful images of classical art. The warriors, the heroes, the goddesses, all of them were reflected in that figure that, like them, dealt with destiny and justice. Through Medusa, the Greeks could see the fragility of human beauty, how appearance could be both a gift and a curse, and how, sometimes, even the most beautiful creatures could be corrupted by pain and revenge. In literature, Medusa continued to be a figure that generated deep reflections about morality, punishment, and redemption. Greek poets used their history as a warning, a narrative in which beauty and suffering were irrevocably intertwined. In myths, Medusa was no longer just the Gorgon feared by mortals. It became a tragic figure, which represented the destructive effects of revenge and anger, but also those of injustice and abuse of power. She was the proof that even the gods could be vulnerable to errors, and that divine punishment, no matter how necessary, could also be cruel. But, beyond the stories, Medusa became a living metaphor of the limits of divine and mortal power. His story showed that not even the gods were exempt from the tyranny of their own desires, and that the decisions taken from arrogance and indifference could drag the victims to a terrible destiny. In a world where the gods looked as unattainable, Medusa became a figure that connected the human with the divine, a woman who had been mistreated by the same beings that had created her. His story was not only a story of what had happened to her, but a warning about what could happen to any human being in his relationship with the forces that dominated his destiny. Medusa also played a crucial role in the development of Greek heroes. Although Perseus was the one who finally beat the Gorgon, the posterior heroes were also influenced by their history. Every time a warrior went out to face a threat, it was no longer just because of glory or reward. Many of them, either consciously or unconsciously, faced the same challenge as Perseus, the confrontation with the divine, the struggle for redemption, and the attempt to give meaning to their lives through acts of courage. The figure of Medusa became a mirror for them, a reminder that, sometimes, the true battle was not against monsters, but against the invisible forces that mold their destinations. With the passage of time, the history of Medusa was also transformed into a symbol for those who sought claim, especially in philosophical thinking. Philosophers and poets found in their history an allegory of the fight against abuse of power and injustice. Medusa was seen as a woman who, despite her conviction, never stopped resisting her destiny. Even in her monstrosity, she maintained her humanity, because suffering never stripped her of her identity. In modern interpretation, she becomes an icon of resistance and the fight against systems that oppress and destroy individuals. Its history is that of unrelated punishment, but also that of a woman who, in her pain, becomes an immortal symbol of the struggle for justice. Thus, Medusa's legacy lasts, not only in the shadows of the past, but in the culture, art, and beliefs that modeled classical Greece and that continue to influence the worldview of many societies. She, a woman transformed into a monster, remains one of the most complex figures of Greek mythology, and her story continues to resonate in the echoes of the voices that tell her, as a warning and a lesson that never forgets. Medusa's memory, as his gaze, is still petrified, immortal. The nights on the island of Gorgon were long and silent. The sound of the sea hitting the rocks was the only thing that broke the heavy silence. Steno and Euryale, the sisters of Medusa, had been left behind in history, condemned to a life of darkness and desolation. With the passage of time, the echoes of Medusa's sacrifice resonated stronger in their hearts. There was no more glory or honor in their names, only the weight of loss and injustice remained. The the two Gorgons walked together, sharing the same loneliness, but also a growing anger towards the gods who had stripped their sister of their humanity. Euryale, the youngest, looked at the horizon, her face marked by anger, her eyes full of fury and confusion. She saw her sister, the beautiful priestess who had been betrayed, and wondered how the gods could have allowed such evil. "They look at us from above," Euryale muttered, with a trembling voice. "They believe themselves above all, above us. But who are they to decide on our lives? Who are they to make us suffer?" Steno, the oldest, had been colder and calculating since his sister had been transformed into stone. He had learned to harden his heart, but that did not mean that he did not share the same sadness and hate. His eyes, on the other hand, were fixed in the shadows of the island, as if they were looking for answers in the stars. "We are nothing more than pieces in his game," said Steno, his low and bitter voice. Medusa was just a reminder that the gods can give what they want, regardless of the consequences for us. Our sister was beautiful, pure, and that was what condemned her. The gods are not interested in mortals or us. They see us as tools for their own interests. How could they do that? Euryale replied, with tight teeth. How could they punish her so cruelly, when she never did anything? All I wanted was to serve Athena, being faithful, and they banished her for being beautiful. That is not justice. That is pure cruelty. The wind blew through the rocks, causing the snakes of their hair to be stirred. The fury they felt was palpable, a mixture of pain and resentment that neither could shake. Why did the gods, with all their power and wisdom, allow Medusa to suffer such atrocious conviction? Why had its beauty been the sin for which she was punished? What sense did all that have? The two sisters walked in silence, their thoughts in the same issue, the eternal fight against what they could not control. The fatality of their lives, the nightmare of having been abandoned by the same gods that once venerated, accompanied them. Medusa had been sacrificed as a toy in the hands of the powerful, but Steno and Euryale knew that her sister's sacrifice had been just a sample of what the gods were able to do. As time passed, his hatred towards Athena, Poseidon, and all the gods who played with the destiny of mortals and the demigods, only grew. They could not understand how such powerful beings could be so indifferent to the suffering they caused, how their own sister had been thrown into the perdition by an error that she did not make, for a betrayal that she did not cause. Medusa had not deserved to become a monster, but the gods had decided that their beauty and destiny were a threat to their own egos and their control. "We, who sacrifice ourselves for them, are abandoned when we are no longer useful to them," said Steno, with a deep sadness in his voice. The gods do not understand the pain of mortals. They cannot understand what it means to be thrown into oblivion, be discarded when anything can be extracted. Medusa was one of us, but the gods destroyed her for her simple beauty. It doesn't matter how much it served Athena, nor how devout outside. In the end, everything they saw in it was a challenge. And that was what destroyed her. Euryale squeezed his fists, as if he could embrace pain and anger inside, as if he could transform him into something that had power. "It's not fair," he said, his broken voice. "It will never be fair. But what the gods do not know is that we, the creatures who have despised, continue to live. And we will always live. No matter how many centuries go, no matter how many heroes try to kill us, there will always be some jellyfish inside us. We will always remember what they did." The two sisters, in their pain and loneliness, shared a bitter truth: the gods had not only punished Medusa, but they had also condemned them to live with the weight of that injustice. There was no salvation for them, there was no redemption or forgiveness. But in his fury, in his struggle to do justice to his sister, a dark flame began to turn on in his hearts. They could not return time or return humanity to Medusa, but they could avenge their suffering. They could make sure the gods remembered the price that was paid for playing with the destiny of mortals. Steno and Euryale had no more gods to pay tribute, they had no more temples to prostrate themselves. His loyalty had been completely banished. Now, there was only hate, resentment, anger against a world that had left them behind. And while the island of Gorgon remained lonely and uninhabited, the two sisters knew that their history, although silenced by the gods, would not end them. the echo of injustice continued to rumble in the waves, and the snakes of their hair, although inactive, would never stop remembering what the gods had taken them away. The story of Medusa became, with the passage of the centuries, in a murmur that crossed Greece, traveling from mouth to mouth, feeding the legends and becoming a universal symbol. For mortals, his name evoked something much deeper than a simple tragedy or a horror story. In every corner of the Greek world, from the quiet coastal villages to the vibrant city-states, the echoes of their suffering reverge, becoming a symbol of injustice and excessive fury of the gods. Medusa, once a beautiful mortal woman, was now a legend that crossed the borders of human understanding. People did not see in it the monstrosity for which the gods had condemned her. Instead, they saw a victim, a woman to whom they tied their life for a cruel betrayal and that, in the end, became a captive of their own beauty. Its history resonated in the hearts of mortals, not only as a myth, but as an eternal warning. The gods, as wise and more powerful as they were, could be ruthless, arbitrary, and, above all, capable of destroying mercilessly. The stories about Medusa traveled among the peasants, artisans, and merchants as a tragic story, but also a reminder. The men and women who listened to their stories saw in it a figure that reflected their own fears and desires. Beauty, a gift that many envied or wanted, was also the source of their conviction. Wasn't that also the fate of many mortals? The sacrifice for larger causes, the struggle to maintain a virtue while facing uncontrollable forces, the pain of being a pawn in a game of foreign powers. Medusa spoke to men as a warning: do not trust what you own, do not believe that your life is completely in your hands. It was common to listen to mothers in the villages to tell the story of Medusa to their children, not as a horror story, but as a reflection on the whims of life and the gods. Be careful with your beauty, my daughter, mothers said, because what can be a gift in one day can become your condemnation to the next. Remember Medusa, the priestess who lost everything for a look. Thus, the image of the young priestess of Athena, transformed into a monster, served as a lesson for those who wanted to get more than they could handle, for those who dreamed of challenging the pre-established destinations. As the story was transmitted, many found a resistance figure in Medusa. Although she was punished by the gods, her suffering transformed her into a kind of anti-heroine, a woman who faced abuse and injustice without being completely destroyed. Medusa's petrifying look was not only a fearsome weapon, but also a symbol of power that can be acquired through adversity. Medusa, despite its monstrosity, represented survival against a fatality that did not choose, and humans began to see in it a silent revenge figure. Many believed that Medusa, even in their isolation, still fought against the gods, in one way or another. In the cities, the warriors and heroes who listened to their history began to see the figure of Medusa as more than a monster. It was often said that those who wanted to face the gods, those who dreamed of demolishing divine power, were inspired by the history of the young woman who had been transformed into monstrosity but who, however, maintained their identity, their power, in his terrible revenge. Medusa became a figure that humans clung in search of hope. In a world where the balance of power seemed to always be inclined towards the gods, she was the reminder that even those who were convicted of divine justice could have a power that could not be taken away. The merchants who were traveling from city to city spoke of Medusa of forms that not only created fear but also fascination. In the markets of Athens and Sparta, Medusa's stories were intertwined with other legends of heroes and gods, but there was something different in it. Medusa was not simply a victim. She was, in the eyes of many, a woman who had been torn by injustice and, in the end, became a symbol of the silent struggle against divine power. As the centuries passed, the men and women of the people, far from the sanctuaries of the gods, saw in Medusa a mirror of their own humanity. Like her, many faced the harsh reality of being small in a world governed by forces they did not understand. His story not only represented the ruined beauty, but also the universal tragedy of human beings that, despite their suffering, could not escape the gaze of the gods, or their judgment. In the legends that talked about heroes as Perseus, Medusa's story softened, took a more heroic turn, and many tried to forget what their destiny had really been. But those who did not forget saw in her a woman who had been more than a victim. Medusa had been a priestess, a dedicated woman, but had also been a challenging figure, one that in her pain and suffering created an indelible brand in human history. The men and women of Greece, in their daily lives, understood the lesson of Medusa. While their myths could be glorified in the temples, in the homes of mortals, Medusa represented something more intimate, something closer, the struggle of humanity to find a place in a world ruled by gods who often do not they paid attention. Medusa's story never stopped resonating, never faded, and with each new generation, its history remained a cry of pain, but also a call to resistance, to force that only suffering could grant. Medusa, the Gorgon, left a deep mark on mortals. His story was not only that of a woman transformed into a monster, but that of all those who were victims of a justice they never understood, but who, in some way, continued to fight to be heard. In the pale skies of Olympus, where the gods gathered in their golden palaces, the conversation became more gloomy than usual. Apollo and Artemis, twins at birth, but marked by personalities that contrasted in everything, walked through the gardens of the sacred mountain. Although the gods rarely questioned the designs of supreme power, there was something in the history of Medusa that removed the deepest. Apollo, the god of light, music and prophecy, could not stop thinking about the deadly young woman who had been transformed into a monster. The beauty of Medusa, such a natural gift, had been his sentence, and everything that had happened to him in him as a sad melody, like a song that could not get out of his mind. How could Athena condemn her that way? Apollo murmured, his serious and reflective voice, as if the same notes of his lyre stop in that thought. Artemisa, her sister, the goddess of hunting and nature, launched a look full of regret. It was not usual for the gods to express compassion for mortals, but something in the history of Medusa touched the hearts of the twins, who had always been closer to humans than many of their divine brothers. "I never understood why the gods felt so threatened by the beauty of a mortal," said Artemis, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the stars began to appear. Medusa was only human. I was only looking to serve with honor, and yet, she was punished for the same attribute that many other gods have had in their own essence, beauty. Apollo nodded, a melancholic glow in his golden eyes. It's ironic, right? Of a mortal threatened so much? Artemisa frowned, remembering the stories that had reached her about the rape in the temple, the fury of Athena, and the transformation that started her humanity from Medusa. Poseidon's desire was what triggered everything, but Athena's response was excess, Artemisa reflected, his voice full of deep sadness. Is this justice? To punish her for something she did not want, that she could not even control? The fury of the gods has been a constant, but at what time do we stop being fair to mortals? Artemisa's words floated in the air, impregnated with unusual sincerity. As a goddess of nature, I had always seen the world as an interconnected whole, a place where everyone had a purpose, even mortals. For her, Medusa was not only a victim, but also a symbol of something bigger, of a humanity that was often raised by forces larger than her. Apollo, on the other hand, had always been a god who was proud of his ability to understand the heart of humans. As god of prophecy, he saw beyond the visible, and the history of Medusa, so full of suffering and chaos, he was presented as a dark omen. Is this the lesson that we must teach humans? That beauty is dangerous? That one can serve to justify cruelty to another? He asked, his tone loaded with a palpable discomfort. I am not sure that this is what mortals should learn. If all they have to do is fear the gods and beauty, so what do you have left? A heavy silence fell between the two twins. In the stillness of the gardens of Olympus, a subtle tension was perceived, as if the air itself had charged with the anguish of the matter that they themselves discussed. The gods, however powerful they were, rarely questioned each other. The divinity rarely allowed doubt, and yet Apollo and Artemis's eyes were full of it. Medusa was someone who did not understand what was happening to him, said Artemisa, his voice full of empathy. She just wanted to serve Athena, do the right thing, and be faithful to her votes. Her punishment was excessive, and her pain is something that resonates in me in a way that I cannot ignore. I'm not sure how the gods could be so blind to what really happened. Apollo approached his sister, his soft and meditative steps. She was not the first, nor will she be the last to be punished for something she could not control, he said sadly. Poseidon v. Ilo, and Athena punished her. But mortals see the story of Medusa differently. For them, she is a victim. Why don't the gods see that too? Why don't humanity see in it the same humanity that we share with the men and women who live down? Why do a monster when what he really did was be human? Artemisa closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the truth of her brother's words inside. There was no easy answer, there was no way to repair the damage that the gods had caused. However, a small compassion stunning had emerged in their hearts, something that was not common among immortals. The suffering of Medusa, his injustice, had touched a sensitive fiber in them, and for the first time, the twins found themselves wondering if the gods, in their eternal wisdom, could also be wrong. Humans will always see Medusa as a victim, and perhaps that is what it really was, said Artemis, his voice full of resolution. We, the gods, have been blind, not only to their sufferings, but those of many others who have been cruelly punished for the simple fact of existing. But that does not mean that we cannot learn something from their history. Medusa, in his tragedy, he has left a brand in all of us. Apollo nodded, recognizing the truth in his sister's words. Yes, it's time to reflect on what we have done, and about what we can still change. Not everything we do in Olympus is destined to be justice. It may be time to show more compassion. And at that moment, under Olympus's star, the fate of the gods. In the shadows of the golden temples and in the crowded markets of the great Greek cities, whispers were woven, murmurs that were born in the hearts of mortal women. Medusa, a woman transformed into a monster, had become the symbol of her struggle. Although the story of Medusa had been narrated by the gods as a warning story, for them, women, it was much more than that. It was a story of oppression, of injustice, of a conviction imposed by forces that never understood or listened to them. Women, fed up with the cruelty of the gods and the punishments that came to them by the simple fact of being women, began to see in Medusa a figure that represented them. She, who had been a faithful, dedicated and pure priestess, had been taken from her humanity by Athena's fury, the goddess who was supposed to be a symbol of wisdom and justice. And yet, Athena's justice had manifested itself in a brutal revenge, mercilessly, without understanding the suffering that Medusa had experienced. Women began talking about Medusa not only as the victim of a god, but as an emblem of their own daily struggle. In every corner of Greece, from small villages to cities such as Athens and Sparta, the voices of women began to rise. In homes, mothers whispered to their daughters the story of Medusa, not as a fear lesson, but as a resistance flag. Medusa was punished for being beautiful, for being desired, they said quietly. She was convicted of not being able to control what the gods saw in it. And we, mortal women, we are equally judged by things we do not choose. Our beauty, our fragility, our vulnerability, everything is used against us against. The history of Medusa became a mirror of women's experiences. Like Medusa, many of them were considered desirable, but in turn the dangerous, as if their beauty were a sin, a danger to morality and divine order. And in this system of oppression, men could obtain what they wanted from them, without repercussions, but when they showed their own strength or simply did not fit the expectations imposed, they suffered the most cruel punishment. In the taverns, the women told the story of Medusa with rabies in their eyes. The priestess's conviction, her transformation into a monster, was now seen as a metaphor for suffering and humiliation that women experienced at the hands of the gods and men. In a society where the honor of the gods was imposed above the pain of mortals, Medusa represented an injustice that could not remain ignored. What right had Athena to transform it into a monster? Women said. What right does any god or mortal have to snatch his life and humanity from a woman, just because something happened that was out of control? Is this divine justice? The women felt linked by the figure of Medusa, because they understood what and, like her, their lives were constantly under the threat of gods and men. Desire, beauty, fragility, everything that was expected of them could be transformed into a conviction. We are like Medusa, they said, transformed for what we do not ask, so we are not looking for. And like her, we are seen as monsters when we challenge the order imposed. Even in the highest circles of society, where women were silent, Medusa's stories began to gain strength. The midwives of the aristocratic families, which previously remained silent, began to question the rules that dictated their lives. The story of Medusa spoke to them in the language of injustice, in the language of women struggling to be owners of their destinations. If beauty was his conviction, then what will be of us? They wondered quietly. If all we have to do is be women, are we all guilty of something we don't even understand? Medusa, the goddess turned into a monster, the woman who just wanted to serve and be faithful, became a symbol of resistance against the tyranny of the gods. And in their silence, in their pain, in their transformation, women began to find an echo of their own existence. The priestesses who once served in the temples began to see in Medusa an empowerment figure, although paradoxically, she was the one who had the least control over her destiny. Medusa was a woman broken by the gods, they said, but their story will be our weapon. The wrath of mortal women was not only an unstressed rabbi ease, but a deep reaction to the systematic oppression they had lived for centuries. While men continued to make decisions in Olympus and on Earth, women, like Medusa, struggled to survive in a world that saw them as mere instruments for purposes outside their will. The rituals in honor of Medusa began to be organized, especially in the areas farthest from large cities. Women of all social strata gathered in secret to celebrate the figure of the Gorgon, singing hymns not to monstrosity, but to the power of resistance, to the right of being human without being punished by their nature. Medusa, in his pain, had touched something deep in them, something that united them through time and space. Through Medusa, women began to understand that their stories, their struggles, were not unique or isolated. The pain of a woman could be the pain of all. And from that understanding, the voices that whispered in the shadows rose. Not only in the corners of households, but in public places, in the squares, in the streets. The story of Medusa became the history of all women who, despite being silenced, continued to fight a system that saw them only as an object, and not as subjects of their own destiny. May the gods look at us, they said now, and see in our fury the history of Medusa. Because although their gaze can petrify, ours is full of fire. And we will not shut up. In the time that followed the tragic transformation of Medusa, his name became a whisper that crossed the cities, the fields, and the seas. The legend of the Gorgon was known by all, a constant reminder of the fury of the gods and human fragility. Each story, every story of his life and his punishment, was told with a mixture of fear and fascination. The mortals, like the heroes, learned to fear what would happen if they crossed certain limits, if they dared to challenge the power of the gods, or simply if they were involved in a tragedy outside their will. Medusa, a simple priestess of Athena, had been transformed into a monster not because of her fault, but by the anger of an offended goddess. Throughout their history, Greece's men and women began to understand that the gods not only ruled the fate of mortals, but could also change it with a single whim, a single impulse of their divine will. What for humans was a love, a passion, or even a virtue, could be destroyed by the hands of the gods without prior notice. And so, the curse of Medusa became a warning. Those who had heard of her knew that they could never be too sure of their destiny. Men, especially heroes, learned that they could not challenge the established order without facing terrible consequences. The history of Medusa was a will on how beauty, innocence, and desire could be stripped of its value by a simple gesture of divine anger. For the warriors and adventurers who were looking for glory, the figure of Medusa became a kind of proof, a challenge that not only represented a physical threat, but also a moral warning. The encounter with the Gorgon was not just to confront Amy then with a monster, but with the dark forces of destiny, with the fury of the gods that, although invisible, were always observing. Each hero who ventured to hunt her, to overcome her, knew that her success or failure did not depend solely on her ability, but also on her ability to navigate in the delicate balance between human power and divine will. Medusa, who had been a simple mortal, had turned his tragedy into a lesson for all who came after her. The heroes who approached their island did it know that the justice of the gods was relentless and that, as in the case of Medusa, any act could be transformed into an eternal curse. Its history was woven in the hearts of mortals as a reminder that love, desire, and power could be easily corrupted, transformed into something that could no longer be controlled. The warriors, hearing the story, began to see Medusa not only as a victim, but also as a symbol of the struggle between humanity and the divine forces. For some, she was a warning of what was happening when a mortal looked trapped in the hands of the gods. For others, Medusa represented the price of beauty and power, something that, if not handled carefully, could bring the end. The Gorgon became the representation of the tragedy that stalked at the bottom of each human action. The heroes, who were looking for glory, understood that their destinations would never be completely under their control. In the case of Perseus, who decided to face Medusa in search of honor, the tragedy of the Gorgona became the mirror in which his own fight was reflected. While progressing towards his destiny, armed with the gifts of the gods, the weight of the curse of Medusa accompanied him. He knew that the sacrifice was necessary, that his victory over the monstrous Gorgon represented not only a personal victory, but also a victory over the implacable forces of destiny. Each hero who followed the Perseus path faced the same choice, to be an instrument of the gods or challenge the destiny imposed on them. The gods always looked, always judged. Medusa was the reminder that the fight against fate was never really in the hands of mortals, and that the price of glory could be higher than any hero could imagine. Gorgon stories began to be told not only as a history of heroism, but also as a lesson about divine power and human fragility. Those who decided to face the fury of the gods, as Perseus did, knew that the price of their victory could be the sacrifice of their own humanity. And in the meantime, Medusa's story continued to grow, becoming a warning and a symbol of what happened when mortals dared to challenge the gods. Medusa, the victim of the gods, had gone from being a simple mortal to an icon, an emblem of the tragedy that runs through the world of men. And so, its history continued, generations after generations, like an echo that resonated in every corner of Greece, a reminder that, in the world of the gods, the tragedy was just another chapter in an endless cycle. The history of Medusa, marked by suffering, humiliation, and revenge, began to transform into something much bigger than its tragic end. In the darkest corners of Greece, where women were oppressed by the rules imposed by the gods and men, a new interpretation of the Gorgona began to emerge. What was once seen as a monster, a horror figure, became a symbol of resistance, a force against adversity. Medusa, the victim of divine anger, won as an icon of those who could not be heard, those whose voice had been silenced by the absolute power of the gods. Medusa was no longer just the woman transformed into a monster for the revenge of Athena. Now, the representation of the fight against injustice was seen in it. Women, who for so long were relegated to the umbras of society, they began to see in Medusa not only a victim, but a warrior. His pain, his punishment, his monstrosity were nothing more than the scars of a battle he never chose, but that he agreed to face the only force he had left, his survival. In the versions of history that began to circulate, Medusa was no longer just the woman who had been violated and punished without compassion. Now she was the woman who, in her pain, had found an indomitable force. His transformation, although painful, gave him an absolute power, a power that did not depend on the whims of the gods. Medusa's gaze, the one that could petrify who looked at her, was no longer seen as a curse, but as a manifestation of her resistance. It was the way she had found to defend herself, to protect himself from a world that had transformed her into a monster. Medusa was no longer a victim, she was no longer just the banished woman. She was the woman who had claimed control over her destiny, although in the most terrifying way. As the history of Medusa spread among women, this reinterpretation took shape. Medusa, the woman to whom the gods had raised, became a symbol of all those who were trapped in a reality they had not chosen. Medusa's gaze, which had previously been a symbol of the monstrous, now represented the internal struggle of those who were forced to adapt to a world that denied them the right to be who wanted to be. Like her, women were forced to load with the burden of being what others wanted them to be, regardless of their desires, their dreams, or their identities. Medusa not only became an icon for women, but also for those who fought against the oppressive forces of the world. In their monstrosity, they found the force they had never had. The men, who had previously feared the Gorgon, began to recognize in it the value of resist. Those who felt helpless in the face of the injustices of the world saw in Medusa a reflection of their own struggle, the struggle not to be crushed by a system that treated them as puppets. Medusa, who had been trampled by the gods, now raised as a symbol of the ability to resist, to find strength in the depths of suffering. Even some poets and philosophers, those who previously spoke of Medusa as a warning or a monster, began writing about it with respect, even with admiration. They recognized in the figure of Medusa a being that, despite everything he had suffered, remained able to impose his will on those who stripped her of her humanity. In his eyes, in his petrifying gaze, the power of resilience, the ability to resist in front of a world that did not understand or value his pain was reflected. Medusa, the woman condemned to live on a lonely island, became a symbol of all the people who felt excluded, abandoned by a society that only valued compliance. In their mutation, in their monstrosity, people saw an opportunity to rebel, to challenge the norms that limited them. his story ceased to be just a tragedy and became a lesson on the force that can be found even in the most desperate circumstances. In the rhetoric of the women who raised to claim their place in a world dominated by men, Medusa became the emblem of female resistance. There was no longer talk of her as the victim, but as the woman who had chosen to fight, even at such a high cost. In their history, the women found a mirror of their own struggle, a struggle they would never ask, but that they would accept with such force that they could not be ignored. Medusa, once the victimizer of her own destiny, was now erected as the heroine of all those who sought to be heard, be seen. Its transformation into a monster became the perfect metaphor of personal transformation, the way suffering can be the catalyst for a deep change. Medusa, like those who fight against a world that does not understand them, had found in their monstrosity a force that could not be bent. And in that power, in that resistance, his legacy lived long after his death. Medusa, who had been banished to the end of the world, where silence and loneliness accompanied her, began to wonder if she could ever escape the claws of her destiny. The gods, in their infinite distance, watched. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who had punished her with such cruelty, no longer seemed so implacable. The heavens were calm, and a strange stillness seized the island of Gorgona. The days of endless curse seemed to fade, although even the figure of Medusa, the feared Gorgon, was the last one left in the memory of mortals. One day, Athena, that severe goddess who had transformed Medusa into a monster, summoned the other gods. It was a decision that surprised everyone, because the voice of the goddess had always been blunt. Poseidon, who had been the direct cause of the fall of Medusa, was silent, without pronouncing any word. The gods of Olympus, gathered before the will of the goddess of wisdom, watched the scene as if something greater were happening, something that could not be explained with simple divine rules. Medusa, in his corner section of the world, observed a different light on the horizon. It was not the red light of the sun at dawn, nor the cold moonlight. It was something different. As a glow born from the sky itself, as if everything he had suffered had been part of a test that he still did not understand. In his chest, a hope was beaten, as small and fragile as he calls her of a candle. Perhaps, in the vision of the gods, something else was born. Athena, facing her own regret, got off her throne, and with a sigh that resonated as an echo in the wind, summoned the creature that had been Medusa. The Gorgon, who feared that her destiny was only more suffering, approached cautiously. The sea hit the rocks around him, but something felt different. It was not the noise of punishment, but the murmur of an opportunity. The gods, seeing her, did not look at her as a monster, but as something else, a victim of her own pride, a being who had been torn from her humanity and that now, in her own way, she had transcended beyond suffering. Athena, with a gesture he rarely used, showed a crack in his heart. It was the goddess who, having caused the curse, felt the weight of the irremediable. Medusa, said Athena, his voice softer than usual, the punishment that imposed you has lasted too much. Perhaps the suffering you support cannot be undone. But I can offer you something else, something that will not return everything, but that will allow you to walk again under a less bleak sky. Medusa, still stunned, did not understand. Redemption? For her? After everything that had happened? The goddess, with a look that crossed beyond the centuries, explained, I offer you the symbolic redemption, not as a forgive understanding the pain behind your eyes. Athena had not only transformed Medusa into a feared being, he had also recognized that the Gorgon represented suffering and injustice. Instead of continuing to feed the hate and revenge cycle, the gods decided to offer Medusa a unique opportunity, the possibility of redeeming their image and history through the eyes of mortals. It would not be a return to humanity, but it would be a release from eternal conviction. Medusa, then, received the promise that his power would not be used more to petrify by revenge. Instead, the gods would transform it into a protective figure for those who needed refuge and protection. Men would no longer see it as a monster, but as a symbol of force against adversity. It would be the guardian of those who, like her, had been banished to the verge of humanity, those who lived outside the limits of the acceptable. They would no longer be their prey, but those who would look in their shadow. In this way, Medusa would not lose his power, but his gaze would not be the conviction, but the strength to defend the homeless. Through it, the gods would seek to teach mortals that even the greatest of tragedies could become an act of compassion. Although her snakes continued surrounding her head, her pain and anger began to fade into an act of redemption that she had not expected. From that moment on, Medusa, the condemned Gorgon, ceased to be the nightmare creature. The travelers and the heroes who approached it did not only with fear but also with respect, as those who have suffered and overcome pain are respected. Medusa, at the end of everything, became the figure that the gods never thought it could be, a symbol of compassion and strength, a reflection of the redemption that every being, mortal or immortal, could reach, even in the midst of the greatest suffering. The story of Medusa was no longer just a horror story. It was a story of renaissance, a story of how, even the most fallen, the most broken, they could find something beyond their conviction. And in his new role, Medusa became the guardian of those who would never be forgotten, a will that sometimes the gods can grant redemption where they are less expected. The history of Medusa has been woven through the centuries, persisting as a story that transcends Greek mythology and enters the heart of deeper human emotions. His tragedy, an amalgam of suffering, misery, and rejection, resonates with those who have ever felt victims of injustice. The transformation of a beautiful young woman into a monster feared by all is not only a story of punishment, but also a reflection on power and her ability to destroy without reason, about the way in which the gods, with their immense strength, can impose cruel destinations without taking into account the suffering they cause. Medusa, condemned to a life of loneliness and horror, became a figure that, more than a monster, embodies the consequences of arrogance, excessive power, and revenge. Through it, the Olympic gods demonstrated the fragility of divine decisions and how even those who seem to have absolute control can be blinded by their own anger and selfishness. The curse that Athena imposed on Medusa was one of the most implacable, but also exposed the fissures of a system that not only punished, but left indelible scars in those who were considered inferior. And yet, Medusa is not only a symbol of what is lost, but also of what can be gained in the fight. Its history is the story of all those who, throughout history, have been crushed by oppression, which have been reduced to nothing, but have found within themselves a force that cannot be destroyed, a power that neither the gods can snatch. Medusa is the voice of those who have been silenced, the gaze of those who have been transformed by pain and rejection, but even in their monstrosity, find a way to claim their own existence. The memory of Medusa, woven over the years, is more than an echo of the past. It is a warning and a lesson for humans and gods equally. It reminds us that power, although absolute, is never immune to the consequences of its own acts. Injustice, although it seems to be imposed at the time, never remains without leaving a footprint. Medusa's memory persists as a reminder that suffering should not be forgotten, that those who have been victims of cruelty must be remembered not only for what they suffered, but also by the force they demonstrated in their struggle to survive. In Greek mythology, where the gods play to shape destinations at will, Medusa remains a symbol of resistance, not only against men, but against the gods themselves. Its history, which began as an eternal condemnation, becomes a reflection on memory and power. The curse that Athena imposed is no longer only the punishment of a god, but a reminder of how decisions, even the most divine, can have consequences that resonate far beyond what could have been anticipated. Medusa, the Gorgon, the monster, the victim and the fighter, lives in collective memory not only as a feared being, but as an icon of divine injustice, a symbol of the scars that leave the decisions of the powerful. Its history, which begins with pain and ends with reflection, invites us to look beyond appearances and question the price of power. In his figure, the message that the memory of the victims, of the oppressed and of the fallen must never fade. The story of Medusa is, ultimately, the story of all those who suffer in silence, waiting, perhaps, someday, to be heard. And although the Gorgona no longer petrifies with her gaze, her story continues to paralyze hearts, reminding us of the destructive nature of power, the unwavering strength of suffering, and the need to keep the memory of those who, as a jellyfish, were condemned by the cruelty of the gods, but never stopped fighting for their own dignity.